discourse on wars and capital, and why he is necessary in some ways, even though he is certainly not a man of the left and certainly not a man of resistance as we know the resistance over the years, but certainly a thinker and someone who I think has something to offer. And from there, next week, I hope people will be able to get to the Mille Plateaux. Mine's falling apart, but anyway, chapter 12 in particular on the nomadology. I think it's a very logical treatise in some ways. It's written in a kind of Spinozaist vein. The model is the axiomatics of Spinoza, which was based on the ethics itself, is formed around the Euclidean geometry, through the elements of Euclid. And I think they're trying to mimic this in a way. This is Deleuze probably more than Guattari, but it's done in axioms and propositions. And if those of you that have read Spinoza's ethics, that's exactly how he proceeds with scholia and corollaries as well. So there is a logical unfolding, et cetera, that's happening. Yeah. So, and there are basically three basic axioms. We can go through that next week, that happened here. And the thing that really interests me here is how they really begin to think through the nomadic in the war machine. The nomadic is really a very interesting concept in terms of movement, logistics, and difference. I'll let Patrick in. I guess I have the ability to do so. So so next week we'll go through this. This is one of the, this book was translated I think not until the middle 80s, maybe even later, but in 1980, I think they put it out in French. Let me just see, 1987 by the University of Minnesota. So 1980 is when they went back to this after the 1972 engagement with Anti-Oedipus. So 8 years after the Anti-Oedipus, so that the dates on this. Of course, the French academic establishment said that this was absolute crazy stuff. They went against it big time. I think the publication of Mille Plateaux actually spawned, or at least the circulation of the manuscripts, Lyotard's intervention when he wrote The Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge, which was actually commissioned by as I've mentioned before, the government of Quebec, here where I am, and which is very far from where it was in 1980, to put it mildly. But anyway, the Lyotard's Postmodern Condition was also written in the heat of this in many ways. And I'll mention a figure, and we'll maybe go back to him when we read the nomadology and something about codes and decoding that was going on. A figure named Pierre Guiotan, an Algerian poet and novelist. I'll put his name in the chat, who was very important to especially to Deleuze and Lyotard. Yeah. So, I'm sorry. Yeah, and I think I'm spelling his name correctly. Let me just make sure. Yeah, I think so. So I'm putting his name. It's an Algerian poet, Tomb for 500,000 Soldiers, a great account of the Algerian War. Eden, 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 which was received by some literary critics, including Joseph Frank, the great Dostoyevsky scholar, and also a book called La Prostitution, which was about prostitution and codes used in the Algerian, North African prostitution rings in Paris, in the metropoles, in the French metropoles. So Guiotan is important in the sense that he really tried to look at, the argot, the moneyed language, the argot signiste that is very active in a lot of this sensibility of France at that time, and very subversive, in my opinion. So we'll maybe talk about that more in terms of nomad thinking and this proposition that I threw out last time, which was that all codes, I mean, Nietzsche's great contribution for Deleuze was that he jams all the codes, right? That this is the Nietzschean moment, is a jamming of all the codes. Now, whether that leads to madness is another story, because you need a code, right? If you deterritorialize all the way, there has to be some kind of reterritorialization. So this is something we can discuss, but certainly the limit is being pushed here in many ways, in terms of how they're thinking and where they're going in all matter. So anyway, I'm looking forward to engaging Deleuze and Guattari again, and some of their insights. This is a remarkably creative book. Again, a book worth studying. It's a very good starter for pedagogical reasons. It's got a very good imaginative moment. It's part two of the capitalism and schizophrenia. Yeah, and again, the schizophrenia is being held hostage now by total historical amnesia, as Beth knows very well in terms of certain chats online right now. People really have a historical amnesia. So anyway, I mean, again, this is a remarkably interesting book. I chose the chapter 12 because of the question of the war machine. And again, like I said, Lazzarato and Alliez, students, if you will, of Gilles Deleuze in the early 70s, which to me was the high point of thinking. I mean, I used to talk to Stanley about this a lot, that basically 1973 marked the great moment of the left, right? Since then, it's been a slide, right? Stanley, of course, wrote many books after that. That's when False Promises was written. But in some ways, it was a really high point of theory, intervention, imaginative work, a lot of things that we could really deal with, and I'll point out in the American context, System and Structure by Tony Wilden. Again, a book worth rereading and revisiting, especially the chapters on the double bind and the chapters on analog and digital communication. Secondly, two books of Jameson, which was to be one book, Marxism and Form and The Prison House of Language, both of which were major interventions in Marxist literary theory, alongside that of Bruce Franklin, who did very good work on prison literature and of course the cinema of Star Wars, and then the work of Yi San-Wan in the Philippines, Marxism and Literature, Norman Rudich. But anyway, these were people alongside of Jameson. Jameson was the one who brought the Russian formalists, French structuralists to the foreground, right? Many ways during this period. And of course, Aronowitz's False Promises, right? It was the advent of a few years of telos had happened. Peter Bratsis is joining us. I feel honored. Yeah, from the island of Casas. Anyway, so I think this is something we should keep into consideration in terms of theoretical investitures and how one can work off of that fundamentally. And Deleuze and Guattari are certainly part of that. And then Alliez and Lazzarato are both critiquing that moment. And most of you that are here, we've done some work on Stiegler, the sociopathology of May of '68, in which he revisits May of '68 as a moment that needs to be thought again, and thought in the sense of, a return to Freud, if you will, and in return to the more pessimistic Freud in some ways. Just like Lacan used to say, I'm not Lacanian, I am a Freudian. So I think these are important moments. But today, one of the reasons for the Ernst Junger is most of you know, I mean, I have a very active background, many years with Martin Heidegger's work of Being in Time and the German Weimar and the philosophy there, and how ontology was rewritten by Heidegger, etc. I find this piece of Junger a very good general approach to where the West was after World War II, and in a way, he's taking up the Heideggerian hypothesis of, and this is a very strong hypothesis of Heidegger, and something that he clings to the last days, is that the Western metaphysical tradition ends up in a nihilistic space. From Plato to Nietzsche ends up in nothing, in nihilism, right? This is the destiny of the West, to come to this point. And our task is to think our way through this, through pathworks. In the Derridian sense, by deconstruction, in the French deconstructionist sense. In the Heideggerian sense, by reading the signs, what he calls the wood paths, and beginning to take a different path and a different way of questioning and a different way of thinking through things. And as Althusser once said, to know the question, we should know the history of the question when we ask the question. This is a very important thing to remember, that to me, that seems to be very, very crucial for our time, to understand what is the history of the question that is being asked, right, in a sense. For Heidegger, the question that's being asked is, what does the Western metaphysical tradition that leads to, excuse me, domination, and I've talked a little bit about this, the three epochs of being, if you read ontology as three epochs, the being as the one, thinking through the one and the many in the classical age, in the Greek age, thinking through being as natura, nature, in the Roman period, up until the Cartesian moment, which begins the third and final stage of being as self-consciousness, that culminates in the system of Hegel, that self-consciousness comes back and is recapitulated and reabsorbed, if you will, by the circles of absolute spirit. Yeah. And then of course that Nietzsche becomes part of this for Heidegger as well. I think in some ways Junger understands this in this piece across the line, but is actually more favorable somewhat to Nietzsche. I know Josh has been reading some of the Heidegger and other people in this group, The Will to Power is Art, The Word God is Dead. The two central concepts that Heidegger has for Nietzsche, eternal recurrence of the same. And I'll mention a great Russian futurist poet, Klebnikov, who's not read by anybody anymore. It's called The King of Time. And he has a very, very interesting attempt to look at history, how it repeats itself in plateaus. So this was an experimental writing that went on. Vladimir Klebnikov, The King of Time, on the Tables of Destiny, it's called. Yeah, so in some ways, very, very interesting work, very beautifully constructed. And remember, between Malevich, right, Kandinsky, all the great Russian painters and the Russian futurist poets, including Mayakovsky, who was much more grounded, that we really had an upsurge, and in my opinion, the greatest flourishing for the first, let's say 10 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, maybe a little longer, of, the greatest outpouring of artistic expression that we've seen since, quote, the classical age of the Greeks, if you will. Or maybe moments in the Renaissance. But, this was an incredible outpouring, but it was also experimental. It was not just socialist realism, pro-cult art, and these kind of things. So I want to point that out too, that in some ways Heidegger's, more meta view of this, and he's thinking this through in terms of concepts, right? Remember, Heidegger is looking at the materiality of concepts and how they play out ontologically during a time. We did not talk in the language of the self until the Cartesian, really until Luther, the first question of subjectivity, and then of course Cartesian, the I think, the cogito, as a moment of the self that thinks, right, in a sense, and how the Hegelian moment basically dissolves this ultimately in the circles of absolute spirit.
It's possessed.
History is. Go ahead, Peter. Yeah, Peter, you're here. Oh, okay. Must have been talking to the cat or whoever, maybe Nathalie. Yeah. Anyway. Okay. So anyway, to go back to Junger. Junger again is someone that I mentioned. And to me is worth reading. I mean, I'm not crazy about, in some ways you can read him as a glorification at times of war, or at least the glorification of the notion of courage in war, right? In a sense. So he's not, quote unquote, a pacifist, in many ways, even though he mellowed with age, but he is looking at warfare, trench warfare. And, there's a trilogy of which this comes out of: Total Mobilization, which is a long piece, about mobilization of labor. The second one is The Worker, right? And then, of course, the question of pain, that Junger goes back to, alongside many, many novels, including Storm of Steel, which is the major novel of World War I, trench warfare, if you're interested in these things, in many ways. So Junger in this way is kind of grounded, if you will, in the actual day-to-day experience of war and the warfare state. But and again, like I said, is a fighter. I mean, this is someone who really believes in the ancient notion of the warrior, the guardian as warrior, if you want to go back to Plato's Republic, the warrior hyphen, king, if you will, or the warrior hyphen man of knowledge, or the warrior that is able to set a kind of transvaluation of values. So this notion of the warrior comes back, in many, many ways. It's kind of interesting, how he does this. You will see this playing out in Deleuze. You will see Dumézil, yeah, I don't know if you've read him, but another French anthropologist for whom was one of Foucault's teachers, who did very good work on the king and actually a post-Kantakovitz, King's Two Bodies approaches to the Indian world and other aspects. So this will be very interesting to go to next week. But back to the Junger again. This is a response, if you will, to this Western metaphysical destiny, if you will, where we are. And it seems to me he sets up two central characters in this, which are very, very important, I think, even for our time, and that is Dostoyevsky and Nietzsche, right? These are the two central characters, two central writers that he's engaging. Now we can talk about, of course, the line itself, what's being examined, etc. But I want you to see in the background that there really is here both the Dostoevskian model, the paradigm, and then the Nietzschean paradigm, and many, many, many very important. So he begins again with Nietzsche and I've been rereading again because I'm crazy. I go back and read the Will to Power. I've been reading the first section, the first two sections. Book one is European Nihilism, which is pretty amazing when you go back to it. And then book two, which is, essentially on the critique of higher values. But the first part, it's about 150 propositions on European nihilism. So this is very, very important to look at. Now, of course, in Nietzsche's case, it is Christianity that has led to nihilism, right? It's the Christian value system. It is that background, the Judeo-Christian codes that have led to this kind of nihilism, the will to will nothing, right? This is really where Nietzsche tries to go. I want to remind everybody, though, Nietzsche's not so simple in the sense that he understood Christianity as a colonizing aspect, but it had different methodologies at work, how it would colonize, very much like our State Departments and CIA operations today. So this is nothing really that new to a thinker of Nietzsche's caliber about how colonization, how domination can be affected, if you will, through different kinds of methodologies. So the debates between Bartholomew de las Casas, that some of you might know, the devastation of the Indies, was an approach to different types of way of treating the Native Americans. It was a different kind of approach than what was orchestrated by Columbus and company, but it was still Christian. It was still a Christian methodology. Nietzsche is very well aware of this, how this operative, and I want everybody to understand this. I know we talk about labor capital relations all the time, but one thing that's been left out of this is the influence and the prevalence, if you will, of a priestly class. How this priestly class has formed so many values over these centuries, right? Beginning with, quote unquote, Imperium Rome until today, right? In many ways. Remember, the Catholic Church, in some ways, has lasted about 1,800 years as an institution. Think about that longevity, right? In many ways. How has that happened? How does that continue? How is it, as Deleuze and Guattari say comically, the latest narrative of the death of God is how the Pope's health is, right? In a sense, they laugh about this. But in another way, with all due respect to Guido Sarducci, if you guys remember Saturday Night Live, this institution, has lasted for a very long time and still has 1 billion followers, right? Including the moment of liberation theology. So I think Junger here seen something. Junger nor Heidegger are believing Christians, believe me, in a way. Yeah. And certainly Heidegger's path is to go back and recapture the Greek conceptual space, and try to rethink the Greek turn, if you will, through the pre-Socratics. Both of them seem to go there. At the same time, I think Junger understands very well, as does Heidegger in a different way, this priestly class that is constantly rethinking. To my mind, it's the hermeneutics of today. This priestly class that goes on in academics. The interpretive models, the premises of the interpretation, how this works, that leads to the cult of the expert, the usual groups of experts and all of this. This is how the priestly class. As Levi-Strauss once said about psychoanalysis in the United States, going to a psychoanalyst in the United States is like going to a witch doctor. Well, maybe going to the witch doctor was more effective in some ways, given Levi-Strauss's comments. But anyway, all to say, this priestly class from the therapeutic, the triumph of the therapeutic, the triumph of the physiotherapist, the triumphs of the medico-juridical complexes, the pharmaceutical, war machine that is going on constantly, seems to be prefaced very much and, sort of programmed by what Junger's, talking about, and especially what Nietzsche anticipated in terms of this priestly class and how clever they were, right? In so many ways. So anyway, so maybe I should ask you first, any attempts? I mean, again, this is a very visceral, a moment, reading the Junger, and again, like I said, it's called across. It's not on the line, it's across the line. And he begins with the Raskolnikov, and all of you know the character Raskolnikov from Crime and Punishment, and the murder is in the Crime and Punishment, and how active this book is in terms of our modernist moment. And then, of course, the will to power that Nietzsche comes up. But anyway, the nihilism, both the prognosis for Dostoyevsky is that nihilism is the final stage, whereas and curable, whereas Nietzsche does not think it's curable, right? And this is an important thing. There is no redemption, right, in the Nietzschean moment. There's only this overcoming and transvaluation that is happening, right? And so very, very much nihilism is a necessary stage. Our question is, or at least one question we should certainly have, are we still in this nihilistic moment, right? Are these wars, these kind of hybrid wars, and the wars that we'll see how civil wars are referred to later by Alliez and Lazzarato, is this part and parcel of an outgrowth of the continuing, meta-narrative, if you will, of nihilism? So this is one question we can certainly put out there, right? And, and I'll read from page 71, optimism or even the pessimism of a response, right? is not based upon that. It's a matter of differences of degree. Optimism, the power of persuasion, rests in profundity, for proof, in clarity. And this is very interesting to say this. Optimism can reach levels when the future is slumbering and fecund together, right? In this case, one encounters it as a knowledge that reaches more deeply than the authority of facts. And I like this, right? Going beyond the positivism is one aspect of a real optimism of the will, if you want to put this in Romain Rolland Gramscian terms. And that one can even create facts. Its center of gravity lies in character rather than in the world. And this is very interesting too. You know, Marcuse late in his life, you know, went back to Heraclitus and said, you know, ultimately it's really about character. Character is fate. And this Nietzschean term, amor fatum, F-A-T-U-M, love of the facticity, right? It's not just love one's fate, amor fati, right? It's amor fatum, to love the facticity with which one is faced. This sort of is intrinsically valuable insofar as its supporters are animated by the will. And again, very important for Junger as a concept. And we talk about terms such as political will, psychological will, etc. This is a real question for us, the hope and even the promise of enduring the eddies of history and its dangers. And, you know, Junger is no fool, right? He understands the volatility of history, that we're not on a straight path, obviously, towards quote unquote progress or change or alteration or modification, that this is going to really be full of, you know, a kind of Heraclitean flux and play of forces that are going on constantly in history, that sometimes are balanced, sometimes completely out of balance. This is not negligible. And then, I mean, so this is a very interesting, this section 3 as a meditation, if you will, or something that you could think about in terms of the optimism of the will, right? And at the same time, the political will, where's the political will today? So he is engaging this. Again, Dostoyevsky is a reaching towards the transcendence that we will be cured, where there is a salvation. For him, it is, you know, and I like, Beth is here and some other people read him too. Pepe Escobar, the Brazilian journalist, who's been, I think, excellent on the Ukrainian situation, you know, has written a very good piece called The Clash of Christianities. You know, very good piece on the difference between the Russian Orthodox and the Eastern Orthodox versus that of the Western Orthodox and also the Catholic tradition. Very, very good in terms of the is strictly only in labor capital relations. We're going to get there, of course. I mean, we're going to you know, engage labor capital and certainly originary accumulation when we get back to when we get to Lazzarato and Alliez. So anyway, then the other thing is that he goes on in section 4 on pessimism, that pessimism should be looked at as the contrary to this optimism. Catastrophe surrounded by pessimistic currents, in particular currents of cultural pessimism. All of us are experiencing this. I certainly am. I would, you know, venture to say you are. Pessimism is going to spread, as with Jakob Burckhardt. So he cites Burckhardt, Nietzsche's friend, who was the coinage, by the way, of the term Renaissance, you know, the civilizational Renaissance. It's Jakob Burckhardt was Nietzsche's friend at Basel, a historian, a Renaissance historian. Yeah, okay. As discussed in the face of what one sees coming. Now, we're all disgusted, right? Roe versus Wade, the propaganda machine, this hypocrisy of, ahistorical attempts to present things, etc. The shootings, the outrageous, and very, very tragic shootings in this place in Texas. which voted for Trump, by the way, heavily. That place. Anyway, all to say, there are many, many moments of this. So this is just a tip of the iceberg. That one's eyes towards more beautiful, although past images. And in some ways, one could be reminded here of Walter Benjamin's Angelus Novus, with one face towards the future and one in the past, right? And the head turns forward in terms of the angel of history, but at the same time, the backward glance is always very important, right? And then he talks about the shifts of optimism with Bernados, the French writer. And again, I recommend a very beautiful film, The Diary of a Country Priest by Robert Bresson, taken from the novel by Georges Bernados, right? The light flares up when the darkness is the most complete. This is the Dostoyevskian paradigm, right? You know the old adage, when it's darkest, the light will come in, etc., right? We'll see the light at the end of the tunnel, right? All these kind of little metaphors that play out. But anyway, this is an old thing in obviously literature, etc. So the absolute superiority of the enemy is precisely what speaks against it. Yeah. Finally, there's a pessimism that, all knowing that the bar has been lowered, considers greatness to be possible even on the new level, and especially prizes the tenacity of those who remain at their post, even though all is lost. Therein lies Spengler, and everybody knows Oswald Spengler's The Decline of the West, also made into a good movie by Fellini. The Decline of the West in C major, I think it was called, the symphony, and a homage to Spencer in a very comic way. Anyway, Oswald Spengler. I had a friend that actually went through every page of that book. I couldn't get through it, but I can imagine the tediousness. Oswald Spengler. All right. So anyway, you can again see that Junger is very well aware of these traditions. Again, I would like to frame this, if you will, between the Dostoevskian model of redemption and salvation on the one side, this clash of Christianities that we're witnessing today, versus that of the pessimism that you're going to begin to see in the Nietzschean nihilism, that it continues to go on. And it's only through a reevaluation of values that this will happen, not reaching beyond, etc. Nietzsche took seriously that we killed God. It was you and I. First of all, our invention, and secondly of all, we produced the murder. And this was on a train in Germany that he had the madman announce stuff. Although this is obviously, those of you that know philosophy, in Ludwig Feuerbach, certainly in Marx, and many other thinkers well before Nietzsche, the God is dead moment. But Nietzsche is the one who put the final stakes in it, from the academic, culture, right? Okay, so the contrary, and this is interesting too, and this is something politically I think could be used very well by, again, the left today. The contrary to optimism, extraordinarily common today, this is page 72, is much rather defeatism. It's not so much pessimism. This is a very interesting moment, right? The distinction between defeatism and pessimism. One can push pessimism to the limit. One can become a Freud. One can become a Nietzsche. One can become, a Lacan with the master signifier in the seminars of '69 at the same time, but not be defeatist, right? Yeah, in some ways. One no longer has anything to set against what he sees coming, neither in the way of values nor in the way of inner power. So the defeatist, in a way, has no alternative in mind. This is kind of interesting, this notion of defeatism, right? Yeah, in this mood, panic finds nothing to resist it. It spreads like a whirlwind. The cruelty of the enemy, the fearsomeness of his methods, appears to increase in the same measure in which weakness grows in man. You can think, by the way, Jean-Luc Godard today said the Cannes Film Festival was a joke for all of its praise of the Ukrainian situation, and he also called Volodymyr Zelensky a bad actor. Yeah, I want to say that. He's on record. My friend Jean-Luc Godard, not my personal friend, but certainly someone I have followed for, close to 45, 50 years almost, 50 years. I think I saw Breathless when I was 16, but anyway, it was made in 59. So anyway, so yeah, at last, terror surrounds him like an element. And this is very interesting, how people speak out of fear, how they act like fear, and this kind of defeatism that is covered up, constantly. And we can read this in today's world, right? In this condition, the rumor of nihilism wears him down. It's interesting. And I like the way Junger works, right? The rumor of nihilism, right? That it lurks, like Nietzsche says, as this uncanny guest that will come in, preparing him for his ruin. Greedily, fear seizes him, increasing terror, preparing him for his ruin, right? Greedily, it seizes him, increasing terror without measure, even the hunt for him. Yeah, so he goes on to quoting Hebel, a German writer, Judith, right, and Hofernez. Anyway, he talks about the hubris of those in power. And this is, again, very important. Everybody knows that hubris is excessive pride, a Greek term used by Aristotle to describe the tragic hero in the tragedy. This is in the Poetics, right? Of those in power. For all powers who wish to spread fear, and this is good, the rest to spread fear, the nihilistic insinuation is the most forceful means of propaganda. And I think this is worthy of meditation, again. For all powers who wish to spread fear, right? The nihilistic insinuation as the most forceful means of propaganda. It works no less for inspiring terror within us as it does for terror that is directed externally. Both and, right? Very, very interesting dynamic here. The former is above all anxious to proclaim the superior strength that society possesses over the individual. It must first bring itself to consciousness morally. The people is all, you are nothing, right? It's interesting the way, and at the same time, it must be present to the mind as a physical threat, as total spatial and temporal proximity of deprivation and liquidation. In this situation, fear performs even better than force. And this is interesting, how fear, and again, I recommend another book, I'm sorry to do this, but I think it's important, is The Administration of Fear by Paul Virilio. How fear has become administered in our epoch and in our time, and how this works through propaganda to brainwashing. And David Salvage is not here tonight, but I thought he had great insights about the split subject and the vertical, splitting that's going on that allows the propagandistic forces, and then how the brainwashing takes place. By the way, these were a lot of experiments done in the late 50s and 60s by MI6 in Britain, and very, very interesting techniques that you see, that were going on. Okay, so this is very important. Again, performs even better than force. Rumors are more valuable than facts. Yeah. There's an old adage on Wall Street: buy on the rumor, sell on the news, right? When the news comes home, you better get out quickly. That's the art of selling. One model that is used on Wall Street: buy on the rumor, sell on the news. So anyway, the indeterminate is more menacing, right? For this reason, the apparatus of fear is readily hidden, and its sites are moved into the wilderness. And then he talks about states, right? Brink on a fear that come to visions of apocalypse. He's very well aware of the nuclear buildup. This is 1949. We're 11 years, 12 years before Dr. Strangelove, which I recommend to watch again. I think it's still very prescient, and good comic relief at the same time. You're going to have to answer to the Coca-Cola company. I don't know if you remember that sequence. Keenan Wynn is the general on the base, and Peter Sellers, Colonel Mandrake, is trying to make a call to the White House. He needs change, and he tells him, "Man, you got to blow open the vending machine." And so Keenan Wynn says, "Well, I'm going to do it, but you're going to have to answer to the Coca-Cola company." Therein lies your authority principles right there in some ways. Yeah. are great films, one that stands the test of time. Dimitri, you're drunk, you can hear. Yeah, you can hear Vladimir Putin on the other side. Joe, you're sleeping, right on the other side. So you can do this in some ways. All right, so let's go back. So they hark on a fear that must grow to visions of apocalypse. So we're hearing this right now, obviously, in terms of the propaganda apparatus. I'm not denying how real it really is, the threat and that possibility. I mean, you remember the acronym is MAD, right? Mutually assured destruction. Why is it the acronym MAD, right? It's insane, right? But that's, where this Western nihilism has led us, according to Heidegger and Junger. They must make the enemy believe they're capable of bringing about the collapse of worlds, right? And initial examples of propaganda that against the launching of flying bombs against England, which remembered the dark harbinger of cosmic disaster, right? Meanwhile, the methods have been strengthened. And we can look at this. Junger, in some ways, the interesting thing to me, again, this is someone who was in trench warfare, was part of a group that was going to take out Hitler. This is no small fry, right, in a sense, that was hiding in his study, right, or in the Black Forest, like his friend Martin Heidegger in some ways, even though Heidegger he took risks with thought, obviously. But Junger is in the middle here, so you can hear it in the language, right, and that no one is afraid to unleash it in conflict, unlimited powers, again. And stages the war of nerves aimed at this effect. And he quotes Sartre that the level, the sum of individual breakdowns, right? He has this very interesting moment with Sartre, right? The presupposition, right, that the interior is the general form of this world, and his decision is more important than dictators and others. He talks about this, a sum of individual backgrounds. The state becomes hollow not only in its leaders, but above all in its anonymous layers. The individual is embraced by and succumbs to the spell of nihilistic tension, therefore valuable. What behavior can be recommended to him in this challenge, right? So, and you can hear Henry Kissinger trying to play this role now. Henry Kissinger is a leftist compared to what Blinken, Sullivan, and the Biden administration. It's amazing. Let's negotiate. We have to negotiate. We can't go to war here. They have a very different level. Henry Kissinger is a kind of, listen, I'm being very glib here, but the voice of reason of those, quote unquote, there, the 100-year-old. Anyway. So, okay, so Junger, and again, this way is, I think, opening up something very, very different. So maybe I'll go through one more section, and then I'd love to, I would like to hear from you. Before we turn to this problem and how to educate, right? How to help those make decisions in power, or there's the anonymous layers, because we're dealing with this kind of faceless bureaucratic time machine, if you will, one certainly way of looking at it, the nuclear clock, etc. How do we engage this? And he's very well aware of this. In the meantime, before we turn, there are some preparation or preparatory diagnostic remarks to make. And this is very good, to me, this is very good essay writing again. Take a step back, let's see what the diagnosis is before we get to the prognosis or the solution, right? So the first is, one must, however, sense nihilism as a grand destiny, going back to what I mentioned about Heidegger, in terms of this is the destiny of the West. This is the way we've been thrown. This is what's happened to us. Those of you that have read Stiegler, somewhat, the prosthesis has gotten us here too. Both the Promethean and his brother Epimetheus are the two culprits. This extending beyond the Promethean energies, and at the same time, the Epimethean measures of the fault, right? And how we become prosthetic in this age, right? In many ways, right? So anyway, one must sense it as a fundamental power whose influence no one can deny. Okay, so if we consult both of the masters, and the two masters, again, are Dostoyevsky and Nietzsche, further down the page, nihilism is the expression, if you will, of the devaluation of the highest values. We have come down, we've talked many years in academia, those of you that are in academia, about declining standards, right? We have gone through this many, many times. My best students today, the difference between honor students and regular students at the university, the honor students are much more clever at cutting and pasting. They know how to hide it better. This marks the difference, unfortunately. This is what we've come to. I mean, occasionally, yes, there's some creative thought, but in a way, I mean, again, I'm making it extreme, but it's really true in some ways, how we've gotten to this point, right? In this state, Nietzsche calls nihilism normal, but as a transitional state. And again, this is very important to note, the will to will nothing, right? This devaluation of values, not revaluation, devaluation of values. It's pathological, implying that one can behave sensibly in what concerns one's current state. This is not the case concerning the past and the future, and here the meaninglessness and the hopeless obtrude. The decline of values is above all the decline of Christian values. Again, yes, the Antichrist, Nietzsche, if you will, he wrote Exe Homo and the Antichrist and announced himself as that, for one. It corresponds to the impossibility of bringing forth higher types. So the Christian world vision or the Dostoyevskian world vision in the redemptive moment here, liberation theology, all these matters that we've heard, corresponds to the impossibility of bringing forth higher types or even conceiving of them. You cannot even conceptualize it, given the Christian worldview, if you will. And this, again, is a Weltanschauung. This is a worldview that Junger is speaking to, right? And it flows into pessimism. This pessimism, and again, very important to Nietzsche, Junger, again, is the Nietzschean, living the Nietzschean moment, according to Heidegger and others, followers, if you will, or thinkers around Junger. The pessimism develops into nihilism when hierarchy, and this is again important, at first disillusioning, comes to be treated with hatred and being rejected. Okay, so this is very interesting that Nietzsche in some ways had this thinking of the hierarchy and how necessary it was. There remain only the values of judgment, that's all. Yep. And therefore of critique. The weak are broken by them, while the stronger destroy what does not break, and the strongest overcome the values of judgment and exceed them. Nihilism, and this to me is crucial, this is page 75. Nihilism can be such a sign of the weakness as of the strength. It is the expression of the uselessness of the other world, not, however, of the world and existence in general. So this is interesting too, where Junger will go and say the otherworldliness or this kind of hope in the transcendent is not real hope, right? Is not really affirming, right? In some ways, it's a really false hope. And for him, the affirmation of the immanence of the here and now is much more, productive going forward. Great growth brings what is an imagined damage and loss, and in general, right? And in this respect, nihilism as appearing as the most extreme force of pessimism can be a favorable sign. So pushing to the limits of pessimism becomes a very productive affirmative moment. In Spinoza, you don't have no movement unless you have negation, right? Right? In Nietzsche, it's that affirmation, right? After the negation, after the destruction, the critical destruction in which you get to this. Spinoza has no concept of nihilism. That comes much later as a topic in philosophy. This is a 19th century term, right? Yeah. And many of you probably know in Russian literature and in Russian thinking that the nihilists were part of the moment, right? You see this in Dostoyevsky, you see this in Turgenev, the Fathers and Sons, you see this throughout Russian literature of the 19th century. Anyway, okay, so we go on, and this is very important, this next paragraph, finishing up to section 6. For Dostoyevsky, nihilism becomes effective in the isolation of the individual, right? In his exit from community, the Kierkegaardian move, if you will. I am the outsider. I am that individual in this present age in which nothing really happens. I'm fully interiorized, right, with this new kind of, dimensions of existence, the aesthetic, the moral, the aesthetic, the ethical, and the moral. And the moral is the leap of faith. And most of you know, again, Abraham, in biblical terms, becomes the model for the religious man or the moral man versus that of the ethical man. Nobody that is part of the ethical universe in philosophy would sacrifice their own son because of a voice. But he takes that leap of faith with Isaac, right? In a sense, right? Yeah. So this is an interesting, thing. But for Junger, again, and certainly for Nietzsche, this is a nihilistic moment, right? In this way. So he goes on. Active nihilism, and he goes, an exit from communion, which is essentially a religious communion, right? And I know I read this last week, but I think it's important. Active nihilism prepares itself like an eruption. And this is good. Active nihilism. I like the term, for me, cheerful nihilism, but active nihilism is good. Active nihilism prepares itself like an eruption, as in the weeks Raskolnikov spends alone in his coffin-like chamber. It leads to an increase in physical and spiritual power. Now, this is Junger thinking through his own Nietzscheanism. This is obviously a projection of the war-like nature, the war character, if you will, in Junger, right? It leads to, right, an increase in physical and spiritual power at the expense of well-being. Interesting, right? It can culminate in a horrific death, as described in the fate of the student Hippolyte in The Idiot. It may conclude with suicide, as with Shmerdyakov in The Karamazov, with Stavrogin in The Devils, with Shmirgalov in Crime and Punishment, as one fears in the case of Ivan Karamazov, and with many others. Interestingly enough, the character Ivan Karamazov, for those of you that have read the Brothers Karamazov, one of the most powerful, two powerful allegories. The one allegory is, of course, the Grand Inquisitor, which is one of the great pieces of world literature, one of Freud's favorites, by the way. He mentions it in the essay called Dostoyevsky and Parasite. And then, of course, the other part is Ivan Karamazov when he goes before the jury, when he goes on trial. And the prosecutor says, let us remember, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this man can see both points of view and can see them simultaneously. So this becomes, very important, this ability, like Lenin, if you will, or like, certain great dialectical thinkers, to be able to hold two threads of thought, both the antithetical alongside the thetical, right? And be able to hold them simultaneously together, right? And this is very, very important in terms of Ivan Karamazov, right? In the best case, it will lead to healing. Dostoevsky, sometimes will lead to, when after a public confession of guilt, one re-enters the community. Now, America is always built on second chances. Please confess. And Peter's here. I don't know if he's listening, but he knows well the essay, Individualism and Conformism in the United States by Jean-Paul Sartre. And I recommend reading this because you'll understand America very well, where the woman says, we believe in the individual here. She's one of the club people, right? You see, when they come into the club, we grant them their individuality. You have no individuality before that. You have to come into the community before you're granted, just like you have to confess to the crimes and then you're okay. Please own up to it. Please face up, the thing, right? Come clean. All these kind of things are very much part of this guilt complex. And one of the reasons, I think that one very interesting aspect of Deleuze and Guattari is this attack upon superego inflection as a culture, the culture of guilt. Lazzarato, the making of indebted man. How does this come about? Why do people just say, to hell with this? I'm going to, just go steal from the stores, right? As Brecht used to say, it's amazing more banks aren't, raided. It's amazing that more stores aren't looted, right? Or borrowed from, that they said about white people in Katrina, the story. White people borrowed, but the black people looted, right? so anyway, I want to point that out in terms of this guilt, and also a very, very good piece to read is Individualism and Conformism, how the United States, for all of its, quote, individualism, quote unquote, this thing, is really a nation of complete conformity, right? In so many ways. It's not until you're inside that you begin to, think. You can think of this in athletes, right? many, many ways, what goes on. So this is very, very important again. Okay, so after public, one re-enters the community through purification in the inferno, right? Or in the house of the dead, one can attain a higher level than before entering into nihilism, right? So the inherent infinities, and this is important again, to think through in terms of both the psychology, if you will, and also where we are politically, are undeniable. They advance in the same three phases. And this is before section 6, end of section 5 of Junger, page 75. From doubt to pessimism, from there to actions in valueless and godless space, and then thirdly to new fulfillment, right? The three phases, from the moment of doubt, skepticism, to pessimism, right? From there to actions in valueless and godless space, and then to new fulfillment, right? This allows us to conclude we are seeing one and the same reality, although from quite different points, right? This nihilism, this uncanny guest, again, that's knocking at the door, that most uncanny of guests, And I think Freud, again, listen, I don't want to, use Freud as always the authority here, but certainly would agree, since he wrote the piece called The Unheimlich, on the uncanny, the notes on the uncanny, in many ways. Okay, so this is kind of setting this up in many ways about this guest and what it shows in terms of movement going on from doubt to pessimism, right? Actions in valueless and godless space, and then finally to a new fulfillment, right? How does this happen? In many ways, right? Okay, so this is important. Okay, so yeah. And then the next section, and then maybe I should stop after 6. I know I'm going a little further than I wanted in the beginning here, but the difficulty in defining nihilism, and again, this becomes a real problem, right, in some ways. We're intuiting a lot here, and, we can go over this later, maybe the Spinoza's moments of the 3 genres or types of not knowing, the intuitive, the definitional, and the conceptual. But anyway, the difficulty in defining nihilism lies in the fact it's impossible for the spirit, the Geist, to gain a representation of nothing, right? And we've talked about this too. Again, representational thinking. We went through this in the Age of the Worldviews, to go back to that in terms of the Heideggerian, the Age of the World picture, right? How this is taken up in the question concerning technology, and how so many people forget because they want representation, right? Going on with, because it never begins with that nothingness cannot be represented, even though we have many experiments in the art world. George Brock's sculpture, he was a good friend of Heidegger's and Junger. If you want to go back in this, certainly the experiments with cubism and many of the moments of the modern project in art, et cetera, to make this, thing. So one makes of nothing neither image nor concept. And this is important to make clear, because what does digitalization do? What does the society of the spectacle do? It basically feeds images. It becomes the society of the images. I'm starting to work on a little something for the summer. I have a section on the society of pornography too, in terms of what the image does, right? The society of community, how these things play out in the spectacle, but it's all image-based. It's part of spectatorship and the spectacle. But for Junger, this notion can never be, an image nor a concept, right? Yeah, and going back to what he said earlier, valueless and godless space, right? And so, right? To work in that void, right? So there's no nihilism, thus nihilism is placed in relation to the outer belt of nothing, right? The outer zones, if you will, outer spheres, to the margins of nothing, but never to the basic power itself. This is interesting. In a similar way, excuse me, one can experience dying, but not death. Very interesting. You want to think about that. Again, a man who fought into war, one to take out, Hitler and company, right? The other one, of course, in the trenches in World War I, right? When immediate contact with nothing is indeed conceivable, swift annihilation must follow, as if a spark jumped from the absolute, right? Malraux and Bernanos occasionally describe it, mostly in connection with sudden suicide. There's a moment of certainty that existence has become impossible, right? Right? And that existence, does then the heartbeat, the circulation, right? The secretion of the kidneys proceed as meaninglessly as the ticking of the clock to a corpse. So it goes Junger to say. Then a gruesome putrefaction would be the consequence. Stavrogin, right, from Dostoyevsky's, I think the characters in The Possessed, the devils, foresees this concerning his stay in Switzerland and chooses the rope. Now, if you're a good Leninist, you give them enough rope and say, here, hang yourself, right? That's another way of looking at this in terms of the nothingness. But he already anticipates the dangers bound up with safeguarding basic security. So we have here also Junger, in some ways, in a hidden way, is saying there is no security state, right? There is no state of security. There is no comfort zone in the quote, this destiny of the West and where we are in 1949, again, almost, 72, 73 years ago now, right? So the particulars of annihilation not only are described in literature, and we all know this stuff. I mean, I don't know, again, a book worth rereading, I think even more than Joyce's Ulysses, is Gravity's Rainbow by Pynchon, because this is a pretty amazing book about some of these things that he's bringing up here, and but also exhibited. The artist does not choose destruction as his theme. He identifies with it himself. And this is interesting. I mean, maybe some commentary from the artists here, or, what's going on in terms of, modern and modernist and postmodernist art. It penetrates his language, his colors. This is the difference between a literature of pure revulsion and naturalism, in which optimism still rules in spite of the ugly objects. So anyway, then we go through the three domains, that of illness, evil, and chaos, the three domains of nihilism that he speaks to. But maybe I could ask you, what did you make of this? I know I assigned it. He's part of conservative revolution. Junger is not a quote unquote comrade. He was part of the national Bolsheviks. It was not an international Bolshevism, right, at work here. There was a national Bolshevism at work in Junger's psyche and in his work. So I want you to be aware of that. The welfare state, right, in some ways, and the welfare of the worker was also privileged somewhat by National Socialism. So there was a national Bolshevik relation here. They never would have been able to garner such support without giving something, right? Yeah, in the immediate. And this is something the left has to learn, because look at what happened with Reagan. Look what happened again with Trump and the working class, right? And, in a different way, maybe even George Bush the second, right? Not so much the first. And what did Clinton do? He turned welfare into workfare, right? Very cheap labor. So anybody want to say anything at this point? And then we can go into the evil, the chaos. Again, this is a very conceptual piece, but I think very interesting to think through, because some of this language is being, and I'll point out more elements as we go on. Yeah. Yeah, David Winters, do you have any thoughts? This is Ernst Junger, in his. Yeah.
Not at the moment. Nothing it's worth taking up everybody's time with. I mean, it's a really interesting piece. I'm happy for the the background. It's very clear that Junger is is not on the left, and his sort of appreciation of contest and sort of his the notion of I don't know, sort of the making pathetic of subjectivity and the sort of renewal through like war and contest. What he talks about a little bit further on from here, he talks about sport in a really interesting way, I think, for our moment, in the way that sport seeks to, like it's a venue wherein people can try to achieve beyond, sort of the day-to-day, I guess, is how he talks about it. And I think there's, as you sort of led this off with, Michael, something like that can't be explained within the parameters of theories of capitalism happening, for example, with consumer cultures, with the public's generally relation to sport and sport teams and the hierarchies within sport, as well as that moment of content within sport, which is something about human achievement. And like, I guess part of the point that you were sort of ending with there is that there's, the stickiness of the sort of conservative critique of what's being referenced here as the welfare state, as something that, like, possibly reading it this way, like in addition to the ways that it capacitates life in the ways that the left would think about it, at the same time also like incapacitates subjectivity in specific ways, I think is fascinating. And the ways that you can kind of see that incapacitation then express itself in, again, for example, the relationship to sport and these moments where it seems like people are super hungry for the idea of like individual striving and individual accomplishment. Like there's something to that. There has to be something to that for it to be such a powerful moment. I think it's fascinating.
I think you raised a very good point. This goes back to the Greek notion of agon, right? And you pointed out about competition and contest in particular, and for where, I don't know if you remember this stupid slogan, the agony of defeat, and the thrill of victory from Worldwide of Sports, but it's really the agony of victory, right, in many ways. And this was a kind of misnomer, right, in a certain way. This agon, this level of competition, this working through the context, et cetera, that really brings, in a way, the jouissance at the end, if you will, or the outpouring of emotion in some senses. And again, a very under-theorized area on the left, right? Even though Dave Zirin will go through the race problem in sports, and we had Lester Rodney, paving the way for Jackie Robinson in major leagues, and there are many other little points here. We're seeing what's going on with this gun shooting with Steve Kerr and this slaughter in Texas and other things. It's amazing that they don't come out and say something about the war machine. This to me is the horrific thing. It's always this reaction to something that's a no-brainer, the shooting up of children, right, in a school, but they will not come out in an anti-war or against the military-industrial complex or the warfare state that is creating this, or a trace about this, right? Instead, it's calling out of the senators, et cetera. But you make a really good point here that sports in the everyday is one way that Junger wants to revitalize, if you will. And I think you're right in a sense. He's very against weak subjectivity. He's against, if you have it, the liberal, once again, the liberal state, the liberal hyphen welfare state, in a way that gives, that guarantees in a certain way. He thinks, to him, this is very inhuman, right? And it's a kind of patronizing, justification of the way the system is. He doesn't put it in this language, but I think you can extract and lead from there. So this is again very, very important to my mind, this agon and agonistics, right? And remember, this was 1949. We're beginning to go into a completely different era, the Truman Doctrine, the McCarthy period in the United States, right? All of this is happening. Not that he's dealing with this, but also the trials, right, of the Nazi war criminals, right, and this capture going on, etc. So yeah, I'm glad you spoke about this. So Patrick near Boston. I know he's not in Boston, but the Celtics yesterday. Boston is completely enraptured by the Celtics' victory last night in Miami, right? In a sense, right? And this becomes part of the everyday. You can look at this from the standpoint, of course, of how much money's bet, how much money's going into this. But the question is, how does it serve the people politically? What is really going on here? Is this, again, the society of distraction, the society of the spectacle, and what is being lost in all of this, right?
It's bread and circuses.
Yes, it is bread and circuses, but in a sense, it's working all the time. That's part of the thing. It's the only thing that holds the glue together. And I have an ongoing, this is my meta narrative, I guess, since the late 70s and the early. How do you deal with the race problem? You basically turn a few people into multimillionaires, such as Michael Jordan. The book was written about him, The $40 Million Slave. You make sports, right, the great way out of the ghetto, even though it was there in boxing earlier on. There's a long history about this. But how did this become so dominant in the culture? Most of the media time, I haven't done the mathematics on this. Maybe David Winters and his colleagues can do this. But, how much time is spent on cable TV, the internet, all of this in terms of the sports world, right? How much is actually taken up by this, including the hooligans, right? The World Cup, the French Open this week, Major League Baseball, the NBA Finals, et cetera, the Memorial Day car culture, right? All of this, how much of media time, how much is seeping through in a way, how much does that language then permeate everyday life? That's a slam dunk, that's a touchdown. We're going to meet the goalpost. You think about this in so many ways that it begins to show you, in a sense, this notion of the agon, right? The contest. And again, this is Nietzsche. I'm in a certain way, not trying to separate Junger from Nietzsche, because he is, in a way, an exemplary figure of Nietzschean moment, because Nietzsche wrote Homer's Contest. This is on the notion of the state in the Greek world, the Greek conception of state, and entitled the piece Homer's Contest, in which the agon is played out, right? And so this is very important. Even Simone Weil, for those of you that know Simone Weil, Waiting on God and Gravity and Grace, and her beautiful letters, extremely intelligent, spoke to this as well, in many ways, this very deep overcoming, this deep sense of this Greek notion of the poem. She called the Iliad the poem of force, right? It's really this story of the warrior, the story of what's going down. So Junger is really positioning this again. And I don't think this is a call just to militarism. We can dismiss it as militarism in some ways, but I think it's much more than that. He's really looking at the way things are. This is, again, 70 years ago, 72, 73 years ago, just look at the Hollywood production of films about war. Think about, how many, things about everything from the 5-part Bourne series, now Top Gun in Cannes. I hear it's horrible. The first one was horrible, but why does that come back? This is why Godard says things he says about the Cannes Film Festival. You've got Tom Cruise being rehabilitated through Top Gun. What does this mean in this moment? Why is this stuff really, coming back? How much is it in everyday life? And we can talk about this too, the militarization of everyday life. But for Junger, if he saw this, I think he would be outraged and disgusted because he doesn't see the agon involved. He sees much more just the emphasis upon winning, upon victory, and that the agon is not privileged. For him, that's where the character is built. But anyway, that's another story. That's the Nietzschean moment for him in a way. It's a conservative Nietzscheanism, but I'm speaking Nietzsche. And remember, Nietzsche had no truck with the French Revolution. This is another thing. There's a very much of a division here, in many ways. So we'll go back here. He is going to mention Marx later. I know this. And the Worker, by the way, his piece, The Worker and Total Mobilization, is a conversation with Marx on the reserve army and on labor capital relations. So just so that this is happening. I'm just of the school, we should read the other side, right? It's important. It's important to know, remember in Wars and Capital, when we get there, the first chapter is called To Our Enemies. So in a certain way, we're addressing here in some ways, both friend and enemy, or if we want to look at this beyond the Schmittian terms, both friend and enemy, depending on the context and depending on the situation. So anyway, the next section, he goes into nomos and ethos, two Greek words. I mean, I like the ethological as a place we should be. We should always be thinking through the ethos, the environment, our situatedness, rather than thinking through just morality and ethics outside as imposed or applied. I like this approach that he's doing here. And the sustaining ideas with the nomos have been lost or in decay, and they are perhaps still alive in the foreground, more visible than one only considers what ought to be actualized, a condition to which there corresponds a species of journalistic historical writing, strictly linked with this development in which the state itself becomes a nihilistic object, is the appearance of mass urban parties, as rational as they are passionate. In case of their followers, they can become so similar to the state that it is difficult to distinguish between them. And you can think of the attack on Washington. You can begin to think of what's been going on in the United States. There are 400 million guns registered in the United States. 400 million registered. You can imagine what's hidden, right? 400 million, right? right? And anybody in their right mind that thinks people should be able to buy AK-47s, right? And the AK-15s is out of their mind. These are automatic killing machines. What need do you have for that? I can understand. Listen, I'm not for, anyway, but, yes, there could be an argument made for a pistol or something like that in certain cases. But for an AK-15 and 47, why these things haven't been outlawed? Well, we know the reasons, right? But in a sense, right? So anyway, to go back to this, is difficult to be distinguished between them. The victorious power in a civil war constructs organs that correspond to those of the state, which infiltrate or leech off of that. Finally, there arise deformities. So he goes through this. Something similar can be observed in armies. So he's making this association between the state as organism, and of course the armies then too, and their instrumentality, right? How it must grow, right? In the armies, right? And that technical order is necessary. So he goes down and again, play what he calls pure functioning. And this is important too, because this is the way the service sector works. Pure functioning. You turn on the switch, you turn on the script, right, etc. You have all of this predetermined codes that are working everywhere. I've gone through this still with my Hotmail account that has not been resolved because I can't fly directly to Bombay and pull out my pistola and say either you put my Hotmail. I'm just kidding, but anywhere, I won't pull the Unabomber mentality here. But anyway, all to say, to go back, to press the button or flip the switch, they therefore adapt themselves without any transition to apparently opposing powers. quite early on, Marxism saw a favorable medium in developing capitalist trusts and monopolies. And this is interesting. He's obviously citing, the Marxist thing, let them develop fully, right? The worker will become more conscious. The worker will become more advanced in these moments, right? In a sense, right? We don't want to go back to Luddite, smash the machines or something like this. But with increasing automatism, armies gain an insect-like perfection. They fight on in situations that older styles of warfare would consider criminal. And this is interesting too. Those of you who have seen the great film Grand Illusion, I'm sure you've all seen it, where Eric von Stroheim and Claude Rains have that beautiful scene together. They're friends, but they're on opposite sides. Is a great moment of the earlier warfare versus this insect-like warfare, right? In a sense. And what we've come to today with drones, killing machines, nothing, going on. And we'll talk more about this. Then the conqueror recruits troops from them under a new banner. Indeed, loyalty will not be meaningful when compulsion, and this is interesting too, what attracts the soldier, what brings the soldier in, etc. When compulsion is refined to a science, right? Not only compulsive armed service, but the compulsion to want to join up, to be part of this insect-like precision in many ways, okay? Yep. So again, okay, similarly, one sees that individuals fall under the sway of any powers the more they absorb the elements of order. Chaos cannot be tolerated. And this has always been, the slogan law and order. What was law and order meant as? It was a way of controlling the chaos, harnessing it through police actions, etc. Right? This is again a lesson. What was Nixon's thing in 1968? Right? What was 4 dead in Ohio, if not calls for quote unquote law and order? In so many ways. And this very, very important to keep in mind. Directed against a drama that returns as soon as it comes to a revolution. Indeed, one cannot turn the elements of society into pure functions and expect that their ethos will remain. The virtue of the functionary is that he functions. And this is interesting, right? And it is good when in quieter times one harbors no illusions about this point. But we have all these illusions. Oh, I can't stand the hour on the phone with a bureaucrat. When we know these are pure functionaries. In academia, the pure functionaries on all levels at this point. David, why you would go into this field at this point, I'm just teasing you. I'm not trying to discourage you. But anyway, these levels of functionaries in the administered world of academia and education. Yeah. And by the way, Patrick, I guess you saw Randy Weingarten in Ukraine. Huh? She was talking, and she has a meeting with Zelensky. It goes to show you the AFT is doing the work of the Lord, CIA, and yeah. You didn't see it?
Oh, I didn't see that, but the NEA is just as bad.
Yes, that's right. The NEA is just as bad as the AFT. That's correct. Yeah. So I think they have better credit card rates. Yeah, but they're both insurance and credit card brokers. Yes. Okay. So anyway, so then he goes into this distinction, and this is, of course, an old philosophical moment, order and chaos, of course. And chaos, therefore, is at most a consequence of nihilism, and not even the worst one. And this is interesting. It remains crucial to understand how much genuine anarchy is hidden in chaos. And I like this phrase, genuine anarchy. This is, the anarchic in the really strict Greek sense really means to be without principles, away from principle, the anarche, without principles. The Greek word, and I think I've mentioned this before, arche has 3 determinate meanings. One is, of course, command, right? Another one is principle, and the other one is obedience, right? So the arche, when you hear an oligarchy, it's command, obedience, right? And principle of the few, right? Yeah, very, very important. And so anarchy is trying to work yourself away from these principles, right? and how much wild fecundity is to be sought in individuals and in society, but not in the wreckage in which the state fragments, genuine anarchy, right? It's interesting. Where is this to be found, this concept of genuine? The aphorisms, and he goes back to one of Nietzsche, in my opinion, lesser works, although many people I held it in very high esteem, thus spoke Zarathustra, directed against the draconian state, right? The draconian state, and in particular, the idea of the eternal return, right? And again, for Heidegger, Nietzsche has two central ideas: eternal recurrence of the same and the will to power. These are the two central concerns, right, of Nietzsche: the eternal recurrence of the same, and of course, the will to power. And in particular, the idea, or clearly suggestions for Nietzsche, nihilism has not penetrated into the depths. And that's probably true, yeah. The anarchist will have often a relation to the perfect and the good, and in his best, it resembles more the first than the last man. This is interesting too, because the last man is the term used after World War II, the last man, right? This end of history, the last man. Foucault, man is an invention of recent date, one perhaps nearing his end. Man is an invention of the Enlightenment, of self-consciousness, but really, when man becomes to be spoken of, right? The nihilist will even regard him immediately as an opponent as long as he comes to dominate. In the Spanish Civil War, there was even an anarchist group that was equally persecuted by both the Reds and the Whites, right? So let us conceive of the difference between chaos and anarchy as the difference, and this is important, I think, the disorder of the uninhabited and the disorder of the living. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, desert and primeval forest would be models. And we'll see the desert at work with the nomad in Deleuze and Guattari. It'd be very interesting to begin to consider this and that kind of thinking. And the primeval forest, of course, in some ways, where does Heidegger operate? In the Black Forest, right? The master from Germany, right? In a way, to play on Paul Celan's great phrase, death is the master from Germany, right? In this sense, chaos is not necessary for the nihilist. It is not a place on which he depends. Still less does anarchy suit him. It would disrupt the strict sequence by which he moves. The sense is true of intoxication, or the same is true of intoxication. Even in places where nihilism shows its most uncanny features, as in the great sites of physical annihilation, sobriety, hygiene, and strict order rule to this end. Yeah, very interesting, right? So nihilism then, first as chaos. This is section 7. And nihilism presents itself as chaos as at the gate, right? And what does that really mean to us at this point, right? So similarly, one stress the opinion that nihilism, section 8, is a disease with caution, right? As illness. With a bit, we find that physical health is connected with, above all, whether it's vigorously at work. With passive nihilism, it is different. The dialectical play of increasing sensitivity and increasingly powerful actions that move our age is based upon it. Primarily, one cannot maintain that nihilism is based upon disease, nor even upon decadence. And this is interesting too, because this exonerates in a certain way the whole decadent moment of the 19th century from Baudelaire forward, the flaneur, the arcades projects of Benjamin, which is very interesting, does not lead to nihilism as a lot of people claim, right? So Junger is in some ways displacing and this notion of nihilism as a disease springs from decadence, right? In some ways, right? Primarily, one can say it's based upon disease or even upon decadence, although both are found there in the nihilistic moment in abundance, but it's not based, it's not fundamental. So if one considers the immense efforts of work and will that the active nihilist demands of himself, so this is a type he's developing, obviously, the active nihilist, right, in many ways. His disdain for pity and pain, and this was the biggest enemy to Nietzsche, and of course, as you know, to Lenin. Lenin could not listen to Appassionata. You know the story, right? He could not listen. He said he would become soft. He could not listen. He was afraid this would make him, soft, right? In some ways. So it's kind of interesting, the pity and the self-pity as great enemies, right? In all of this, right? The fluctuations from high to low temperatures to which he exposes himself, and the cult of the body and its worldly powers that one ordinarily finds in him, one must admit that he has received the gift of good health. This is another point, right? And in fact, one can discover that he established a level of performance that he demands of himself and others absolutely. In this, he is not unlike the Jacobin, who can be considered one of his precursors. So this is interesting in some ways, this active nihilist as Robespierre, as Saint-Just in some ways, even though they tried to replace as a type, Toussaint, if you will, in Santo Domingo's slave uprising, that Junger is, again, looking at types who have no time for the pity and fear, for, the incredible ability to tolerate pain, et cetera, et cetera. And again, Nietzsche, again, said the last Christian died on the cross. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'll turn off my phone if it keeps ringing. Okay, so this is very, very important to keep in mind here, this type, this active nihilist type. I want to say too, that Nietzsche, in a way, it's very important to keep this in mind, played a role as an Übermensch in Russia, right? In Russia, that this was an active concept during the Bolshevik times, this Übermensch, this overcoming of man, this overcoming of the man as such, et cetera, right? Very important, right? Yeah. So I'm sorry about the phone. I'm gonna, yeah. Anyway, so then he goes into the Cyclopses and the Titans. He makes these moves, obviously, between the ancients and the moderns, right? And, he talks about the camps and the prisons, and he brings up, of course, Siberia here. And by the way, one plan in the State Department is to divide Russia into three: European Russia, Eurasian Russia, and Siberian Russia. And this is one plan that's on the drawing board, by the way. I just want to let you know. Yeah, so just to give you an idea of how the warfare state is thinking at this point. Okay, so this is very interesting too. The adversary is no longer seen as a man. He stands outside the law. And this is the question of the school of civil war. He goes on with this. The one and the other, triumphant or even in Spain, is a stalemate. What is common in all the encounters is the complete mercilessness, right? No mercy. No longer a man standing outside the law. And of course, this is indicative of the war machine at work, the warfare state. You stand outside the law, right, in many ways. Forget Geneva Conventions, forget these kind of things. How many times are we going to hear about war criminals? How many war criminals do we know that have been brought to trial? Pinochet? No. We can go down the list, right, in a sense. Yes, of course, we had Nuremberg, we had, again, I recommend the great film, great acting performance by Maximilian Schell, both in Judgment at Nuremberg as the lawyer, as the defense attorney, as well as playing Arthur Goldman in The Man in the Glass Booth, Eichmann, in other words, and very interesting in this regard. But anyway, all to say, we have none of this really enacted today. The International Criminal Courts, the War Criminal Tribunal Bureau. Sartre and Bertrand Russell joined forces together to claim, war crimes against the U.S. during Vietnam. How far did that get? That was in 1965. Yeah. The war went on 8 active years after that, and much longer too, as we all know. Yeah. And certainly before. All right. So then he goes through going back to the materiality of World War I. And then, as David Winters brought up very accurately, a special type of work called sport on page 80. And I think this is, again, something really worth thinking about, very important, about this notion of sport, right? And he has some very good things to say here. I mean, very insightful. The great theme of the last 100 years is nihilism, regardless of whether it enters discourse in its active or in its passive forms. In this respect, it is irrelevant to the value of the work, whether it is by weakness or power. There are variations in one and the same play. This is in literature. In authors, it's different. And this is important to remember too. And we have this category, is he on the left or not on the left? Verlaine, Proust, Georges Trakl, Rilke, even in Lautréamont, the founder of surrealism with Rimbaud and Lautréamont, Nietzsche, Rimbaud, Barrès. Much is nevertheless the same. The work of Conrad, noteworthy for when resignation and action are kept in balance and rigorously intertwined. But pain is present in one as in another, and probably courage as well. The great turning point, right, lies in the fact, and again, I think this is across the line at work, is the fact that annihilation is first felt in suffering, first experienced in our suffering, the annihilation. Often this brings us ultimate beauty. And this is Junger talking about, and I don't like this especially, but this is Junger in his Poetics of Warfare, right? Brings an ultimate, like the first frost in forest, and a refinement that is unavailable to classical ages. Then the theme shifts into resistance. It poses the question of how a person faced with annihilation can endure in the wake of nihilism. And I put in my marginal notes, those of you that have read The Sound and the Fury, if you remember Dilsey, the character who works for the Thompsons, she says, we will endure. And I had a very good black friend, and I don't know what happened, from New Orleans years ago, who wrote a brilliant paper about how she was a resigned black person, saying we'll only endure, right? In a sense. So this notion of endurance in the Old South and in the Faulknerist community was taken as a sign of weakness and resignation by some of the black intellectuals, and certainly there, and maybe too by, and in some ways by Junger. The experimental is common to all of them, a provisional attitude and awareness of the dangerous situation. So this is an interesting review of literature, right? In 20th century literature. It's not all of our people. There's no representatives from the global South or from, developing nations, if you will, or those that come from the law of unequal development, et cetera. But, these are modern thinkers who are thinking up and during, World War II, right? And the awareness, the great menace, the two traits that determine style over and above languages, peoples, and empires, for there can be no doubt after the fact that such a style exists and is alive not only in technology, right? So this is the style of nihilism, this ability, this question of total annihilation, etc. One could add that a comprehensive account of an age belongs the knowledge of its extreme wings, in the present case, therefore, knowledge as well as the passive, as well as the active encounter with nothing. This double hold explains the effect that Nietzsche still holds upon our minds. So I think this is very insightful. The active and the passive nihilism, right? Are we going to overcome? Do we do so with activity? Patrick knows some phenomenology. In Husserl, we have active and passive genesis in constituting objects. What does that mean? In terms of how we appropriate things, etc. And in Nietzsche's case, what is the will to power? Is it active or passive? And this is a whole school, by the way, those of you that follow, some of the developments of philosophy, the Italian Nietzscheans, especially Gianni Vattimo and others of that school, the Italian hermeneutical school, are basically talk about weak dialectical thinking, which is a weak nihilism, by the way, and not the Junger active nihilism, which came out in a different way. So this is very important to pick up. This was an 80s and 90s thing around the hermeneutical, tendencies vis-a-vis Heidegger and then, of course, Nietzsche. So then he goes in section 9 about the schools, right? And peoples and races. So again, this is this encounter with nothingness and the great health. Nietzsche was always trying to prepare us, if you will, for the great health, the overflow, the the over flourishing, if you will, in a sense, this kind of magnanimity that we're so lacking in this world, right, at this point, right, in terms of the Aristotelian notion of friendship and, what is to be done. So I think this is also very, very important to keep in mind. So he goes through professional theories, to look at nihilistic goals. Again, the attack upon the professorial class, right? And he goes on, again, page 9, Junger talks about this song that illness increases, the immense numbers of doctors already indicates this, this proliferation of doctors, in the culture. There's a nihilistic medicine whose characteristics lie in the fact that it does not want to heal, but pursues other ends, and this school spreads. We can look at the pandemic in this kind of thing. Do they really want to heal COVID-19? What is this experiment really about here, in a sense? Is modern medicine really about healing? Is public health about healing? No, in so many ways. It's really ultimately about, capital. It's about capital and health. It's not really about, the healing of the subject and et cetera. And as John Waters once said, if you gave kids imagination when they were going to school, you wouldn't have the need for such drugs in the high schools, that proliferation in many ways. He was, I think, very intelligent about that. If you really stimulate and build the mind and the images in this moment, it would be very, very different. Okay, so anyway, Nietzsche was correct. Nihilism is a normal condition. So our normative condition of this period, as we get into wars and capital and the war machine, is that nihilism lurks behind as a very normal condition and pathological, he says. But according to Junger, it's prefaced or predicated on values that are no longer or not yet in effect. So the loss of the value, if you will, and a lot of us are experiencing this in education and other places, versus that, and then of course, the overcoming into new values, that ability to take the risk, right? So the left is always rehearsing the old, right? In a way, I have this kind of joke, Beth is no longer with us, but we need the praxis nursing home. We can do Trotsky-Stalin debates in rounds early in the morning, then we'll go on to, aesthetic theory in the afternoon, take the lunch with a good, anyway, borscht and other things, et cetera. And, this again, it's where the left is in a certain way. It's kind of interesting to me that you would have this. It's the same old debates, the same old repetition, et cetera, et cetera. And, we need to really break through that into something much more imaginative, that Leon Trotsky said in 1938 this, and Joseph Stalin responded by this, et cetera. We really need much more, than that, In a way, this is the Nietzschean and Foucaultian view of history that can be very, very solid, the effective use of history. Nietzsche talked about the monumental, the ancient, and the critical forces in history as a very different way of doing things. What do you monumentalize? What do you leave to antiquity? How do you work these layers of history? And how does history then ultimately be effective as we go forward? So I think this is very important. Uses the image of a lukewarm winter wind as a result of which, where one could travel when no one would be able to go any longer, right? The image is good. Nihilism, in its destructive and future-laden violence, recalls a warm wind coming down from the mountains. The effect on systems is quite similar. One paralyzed, another livelier in its well-being and spirituality. One knows that in many lands, offenses are judged more mightily if they are committed when the warm alpine wind blows. So this is, Junger going back to those trenches, if you will, and this, attempt thing. So the third distinction then would be the equation of nihilism, first as chaos, the second, of course, nihilism with health and sickness and, et cetera. And then nihilism now as evil, the relationship between nihilism and evil. And of course, we know the great phrase by Hannah Arendt, the reality of evil, in terms of Nazi Germany, the thing that got her into big trouble when she said that Adolf Eichmann was just following orders, You all know the story. I recommend the movie, by the way, very, very good, with Barbara Sokola playing Hannah Arendt during that period. It focused on the Eichmann thing, and Heidegger comes across as a very submissive philosopher to the beauty and glory of Hannah Arendt. He comes across as no longer her teacher in a certain way. Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. Anyway, the evil too. The great crimes, evil barely appears as a motive. There would have to be a villain that takes advantage of the nihilistic process. Natures of this sort are rather disruptive agents. Indifference is more suitable. And this is, again, a time of that we're engaged in where the indifference is so much there, and the apathetic. To my mind, the real enemy out right there right now is the apathos, this lack of being able to suffer. I'm not saying we go looking for suffering. That's not the issue. The issue is the ability to undergo, right? To undergo experience, to undergo it. We're denying this so much, the apathetic, apathos, in a sense. It's not pathos at a distance, it's apathetic. It's away from any pathos. Right, in a sense, and this, intolerable indifference that so many people have, in so many ways, right? And then he goes on, drops in the climate, the new flood. Okay, so then he goes on about Holden, the highest hope is contained here. When it's the darkest, again, the light at the end of the tunnel, or as Heidegger would say, technology will reveal in its greatest danger its potential liberating force. This has always been the hope, if you will, of German Romanticism. Yeah. And we'll talk more about this next week when we do Deleuze and Guattari, because they have feelings about and strong relations to German Romanticism. But anyway, the principle of hope, which I'm rereading of Bloch, by the way, of the 3 volumes, very beautiful in some ways, but needs to be thought of also alongside the pessimism of Albert Camus, who said, I live without appeal, even though Camus, was no longer really of the left in the end of his life. During the resistance, he certainly was. But from 52 on, after the publication of The Rebel, there was a thoughtful reaction, if you will, to French leftism by Camus. But he said, I live without appeal, right? And I live, that hope is the last thing to come out of Pandora's box, because it's the most evil of all things. He went back to that myth that all gifts, the last thing to come out of the gifts was hope. And it was the most evil of all. This was Camus late in his life. Live without hope and without appeal, in a way. I mean, in a kind of the imminence of the Algerian Nights, if you will, if you want to go back to, his early time in the Algerian moment. Okay, so, and then he wants to go out Junger will then talk about symptoms, not causes, of this thing, the nihilistic thing, to reduce the world. And this is important, and David's not here, but we talked about this last week a little bit, the psychoanalytic theory of this vertical splitting that takes place, and what's being let in terms of the propaganda apparatus, to reduce the world with its complicated and multifaceted tendencies to a common denominator. Yeah, Putin is evil, right? Yeah, Randy Weingarten is good, right? These kind of things. I'm sorry to do that. I should be better in terms of those analogies. But anyway, anyway, and very, very interesting here, the way he looks at this, how this is operating in our minds and what happens in this. And again, along this line, I will certainly mention 2 great books. Patrick has mentioned the great Lowenthal book on Prophets of Deceit, right? And the other one is Adorno's book on the speeches of Martin Luther Thomas, right? The psychological techniques of Martin Luther Thomas. It's a brilliant book, in terms of the use of rhetoric that is very appropriate today for talk radio. How did Limbaugh, how did these people get to where they are? Tucker Carlson now on TV. How did Fox News develop? What is this right-wing populism that actually is very easily can incorporate left-wing populism, in some ways, in many ways. It's kind of interesting. Yeah. We feel your pain. Yeah. Right. It's horrible, your job there in the factory. Horrible that you were laid off. Yeah. We're going to fix that. Yeah. Listen, let me show you this gun I got. Anyway, this is, kind of the thing. And again, I really recommend Arlie Hochschild's work on the Trump people. And she went in Louisiana and did very good empirical work, right? Yeah. It's called Hannah Arendt, George. I see your thing in the chat. Yeah. It was made about 10 years ago. It starred Barbara Sukova is the actress who played. She also played Rosa Luxemburg, same actress.
Easy enough to remember.
Good. Okay. So anyway, so going back to this again, this common denominator, it seems to be constantly a thinking. And if you read the New York Times and you pick up on patterns, gestalts of the way that all these things are being reported today, it's pretty clear they're reducing everything to common denominators. It's very, very clear to my mind, what's going on in terms of this propaganda apparatus and how it's working. So I think this is important to, again, look at how complications, sophistication, multifaceted tendencies become reduced to a common denominator, and then everything becomes predicated on that common denominator, right? And this is basically how techniques of persuasion, techniques of propaganda, and then of course techniques of, we don't like the phrase, but it's certainly going on, brainwashing. I mean, constantly. Why is this so hard to break? Really in a sense, if it hasn't been washed and reinforced so many times going forward. So we might as well call it what it's been, right? In so many ways over these years. And how do you undo that? Right? Okay. So then section 12 is the question of vertigo and the disappearance, if you will, of wonder and curiosity. And this to me is part of the apathetic, the tendency of a pathos, apathy, apathetic notions, right? Many ways. And how, how this plays out, this lack of curiosity, this lack of wonder. And he uses Eureka of Poe as one example. So you can see Junger is a learned man. This is not someone just, like Steve Bannon or, these kind of characters, just mouthing off. These are people that read, and they're thinking through something, maybe not the way we want to think it completely. Again, I don't want to make excuses for Ernst Junger. He knows what he's talking about, but at the same time, it's not a transformative thing that is really, Marxist inspired, right? It's more of a Nietzschean transformation. Yeah, David. Yeah, please.
Yeah, Michael. It's occurring to me that, one of the things that I'm finding most valuable about it is the, what frustrates me. One of the things that frustrates me with sort of the liberal left is its seeming impossibility of tarrying with the negative, right? Of taking a position based on values or a vision of the future that might bring them into an open conflict, that might mess up the polls, that might lead to a lost election, that might lead to people up the chain and down the chain losing their jobs in PR and whatever. Right. And so, like, examples, the way we see this playing out currently, after the shootings, the school shootings, the most firm position any Democrat will take is like slightly stricter gun laws, right? Like nobody will say anything really strong about like clawing guns that are out their back or taking any real strong position on the existence of weapons or any kind of root causes of this violence. Right. And their comm strategists will say, of course, you don't take a strong position on this because you might lose, moderate votes in wherever, right? Same thing with Roe v. Wade. The strategists, who mostly dictate the messages that are going to flow through the journalistic apparatus, are telling everybody, you definitely, if you're a Democrat running for office, you definitely can't take a position that's strongly in favor of abortion, strongly in favor of women's access to reproductive health, because again, you might lose some moderate voters and therefore lose an election and therefore. So like, and these are just two of the most recent examples, right? The impossibility of taking, like, so constantly parrying away from what would be a conflict means that, like, the left, insofar as these, like, larger movements, organizations of the liberal left represent whatever the sort of left is, as far as it can manifest itself, their like studious avoidance of any conflict means that no vision of the future is developed, no taste for fighting is developed, no ability to fight is developed, no group solidarity, that the kind of solidarity that can only develop through fighting for something that a group of people believe in, even though the negative is being carried with, even though you might lose, and even though the stakes might be very high. Like, all of that value, all of the energy that comes from those experiences is lost from the left in the US, and has been for generations now, right? Like, that, you could almost articulate that as kind of the function of the liberal left, is to make sure there is no fight over anything ever that might construct a kind of class consciousness, that might construct, that might be, in the way that Stanley put it, like, right, like a class in formation, like a class actually having fights about these things within itself and against opponents. So the value of this piece and Junger so far for me is to not to necessarily stand in Junger's shoes fully, but to take insight into the way that conflict, like, develops the character individually and collectively, and the way that avoiding conflict will also develop the character individually and collectively, and the differences between those two things, and the way the left in the US now may well be suffering from, like, what happens to a character when over generations it avoids the fight, right? Like, when nihilism takes the form of avoiding any fight at all, then, like, you end up where we are, with like a spineless, sort of formless left that can't take a position on anything and can't decide what it's going to fight for. So, like, the importance of that moment of fight is something that, like, I think Junger is speaking to in from his position in a really in-depth and interesting way. And I think there are important insights there about how we develop our strategy.
Very good, very insightful remarks about the function of the liberal class and what they serve in the society for capital and for domination. There's no question in my mind what you said, how they function, et cetera, in the general scheme of things. And also, in a way, Junger is definitely talking again about the agon, right, which you mentioned earlier, this whole space of the competitive, the conflict zone, right, and what it means to be engaged in the contest. And the avoidance of the context, I think, turns many people much more to the right, in some ways, where they see, I mean, I'll use an old phrase, where they see some muscle, right? And they see very little muscle on the left at all, being able to stand up. And this is another thing that you see. I mean, I'm not talking about Democratic Party as the left, but it's a skeleton, the Democratic Party. It has no flesh on it at all. We know this in a sense, but they're going to go out and talk about the issues as such. But we've lived, I've certainly lived through, 40 to 50 years of boredom, to play on Leonard Cohen's, for trying to change the system from within. But at the same time, during that period of boredom, the left has always chosen one pet peeve each decade to go through, right? And never has that kind of struggle to say, look, in some ways, this is also about building character. It's about building responsibility. It's about building free subjects and real free thinking in a certain way. And this is not happening the majority. There are people, I'm not saying that there aren't people on the left that think, about these things and have engaged it. There are many people that do. But in general, it has been the tendency that has devolved. And one of the reasons there is no voice, in a sense. And people will say, oh, we don't have any audience. We don't get out there to do it. Well, you make an audience. You think these people are sitting around the Third Reich and they put together an army that is going to take out the government. I mean, they're doing what they tried to do at it's a very different thing, obviously, in 1940, but in a way, they're not sitting. Hans Jonas is sitting in New York, the little guy. I met him. I had the pleasure of meeting Hans Jonas, the little short guy. He's like 5'2". I'm going to build an army. He got together with all his German friends, and they were going to go to Germany and fight. They actually had built it up. But anyway, this was a very different moment, yeah, in this way. And look, one of the ways we have our thinking, of course, we have privileges of the resistance. We have privileges of many people that have been in jail. Of course, the Panthers, many, many groups that showed enormous courage in the face of all of this. I'm not saying, but the problem is what was happened in this long march through the institutions and how valueless it is, and that the institutions themselves have become nihilist. Nothing was delivered. There's nothing there. This is what it is. And this is one of Nietzsche's great critiques from Schopenhauer as educator, which I recommend reading on education. He and Marx have many similar characteristics about the bourgeoisie when they look at this class that is developed with power. And so I don't know, this seems to me to be part of what he's talking about. By the way, when you mention negative thinking, the Marcuse 5 pages note on the dialectic of reason and revolution is a call to go back to negative thinking, by the way. The critique, right, is an all-out attack on what's going on in the United States, right, and in the West, in a way, the inability to think negatively anymore, or which you mentioned in terms of carrying with the negative, the Zizek'ian, Hegelian phrase. But, Marcuse is first-rate Hegelian, probably even better than Zizek, but anyway, in that, but I'm prejudiced. But anyway, yeah, I mean, very good point. And, both Benjamin and Marcuse wrote on character as fate, as did Benjamin. They basically talked about character, and this is never really spoken about. It's always the critique, the descriptive hyphen critiques, but they never really talk about the character formation, etc. And, in some ways, the 3 great alternative moments, at least in the 50s, was Paul Goodman, Growing Up Absurd, Life Against Death, Norman O. Brown, Marcuse's Eros and Civilization, 3 fundamental books of the, I can go through some more, but those seem to be, but they all emphasize one thing. Ultimately, the character formation is important, whether it's through the Gestalt therapy of Goodman and what he was thinking about, O'Brown, talking about what is the responsibility of the Dionysius against the crucified, which is Nietzsche's phrase, right, in some ways. And O'Brown has it's a kind of hidden and veiled apologetics for a Christianized, if you will, Nietzsche. And Marcuse, of course, this moment of, translating Freud into a more Marxist framework that could really be transformative, right, in a sense. So, but again, they are emphasizing character in a way, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying. I mean, and this plays, this kind of weakening, this weak dialectical thinking plays perfectly into the hands of the oppositions, right? The liberal is the enemy, number one. Sartre is very good on, well, Marx, of course, and on the Jewish question, but Sartre's rewriting of Anti-Semite and Jew on the Jewish question, the liberal is the problem, right? Late liberalism, like our friend Peter, who's hidden here, is late liberalism is really the culprit throughout all of this, in a way, yeah, because it keeps promising the welfare state. Nothing is delivered, right, in some ways. 2 gains by workers in the 20th century: Social Security, unemployment, that was together in the 30s, and then in the 60s, Medicare and Medicaid. That's it. I mean, look, better laws, OSHA, working conditions, but in terms of real material benefits, and some kind of semi-guarantee for health care and a pension, and Social Security obviously didn't work out that way, and Medicare and Medicaid for some people it only covers 80%. Medicaid's actually better, but anyway, it was a start, right? And it was something very, there was a notion of, some kind of, old age security, and at the same time, health security. But other than that, there are very few real movements that, are real entries into this.
It strikes me too, Michael, from the perspective of not exactly character development, but the way that Stanley talks about class formation and how class works, and the importance that he places on intra-class struggles, like struggles within a class to form. Absolutely. Like my limited experience, but my couple of years working within an AFT union, one of the things that was so disappointing about that is folks who, like you mentioned that, we don't organize, like the folks who have those titles, right, who call themselves organizers, tend to work more as like direct marketing managers, right, and as like people who are trying
right, that engage, at the level of, we're going to go to negotiations, contract bargaining, which, since you mentioned Stanley was totally against false promises. In some ways opened up the possibility that collective bargaining agreements could be destructive to unions. The CBA, in a way, kept militancy out of the unions. It was a way of selling out the unions. That's a double-edged sword. You can think about this in terms of levels of mediation, but in general, he's fundamentally right. Because what does the collective bargaining agreement do? It gives you 5 years, if it's a 5-year contract, labor peace, and your only avenues are the grievance procedures, and you know how bad that is. When you really think about this is very thing, whereas wildcat strikes, year-to-year contracts, etc., might keep people much more on their toes and keep the employers thinking, there's something maybe happening here. Right?
And as false promises alerted me to, right? Once you get towards negotiations, everything's run by the lawyers, right? So like even the organizing work is dictated by the lawyers. They tell the organizers what they need as support for their contract negotiations. Right. And then the organizers make sure that everybody down the chain is on board with that. And anybody who's not on board with that has to be disciplined in one way or another, because you can't fuck up the messaging, because again, like they function exactly as a marketing apparatus. They think as a marketing
what we're talking about is exactly what Junger is bemoaning and critiquing, right? In a sense, is this bureaucratization, this kind of, liberalization, if you will, of the institutions, of which the marginalized are the ones with the courage, the ones with the ability of character to withstand this and go on in an active nihilistic sense. He's not using these terms, just weakly and to write a college essay. Active and passive to him has real meaning, in a sense, so really, in a sense, this is what's happening. And he's very well aware of this. This is one part of nihilism that he sees as very destructive, right? In some ways, right? In a way, it's the nihilism that leads to nothing, the will to will nothing, right? This is really what Nietzsche is critiquing, and it's a kind of Christianized value system, as you know. It'll be better next contract. The hereafter, 5 years, right? You just keep believing. You keep going on. Pay that dues. Put that money in the tray.
And then there's if I could just mention,
do your communion once again. Be sure you join again, right?
And the double-edged sword is really evident at Rutgers, where like for adjuncts, for example, we at Rutgers do in fact have one of the better contracts that adjuncts have in New Jersey. Now it's shit and our everyday lives suck and you can't make a living as an adjunct in a contract at Rutgers or anywhere else. But because Rutgers is a little bit better than everybody else, AFT says, look at this amazing job that we do.
Oh,
If
yeah.
we didn't have us here, we wouldn't have this best contract in New
I can see
Jersey.
your photo in the AFT newsletter, or whatever the New Jersey NEA or whatever affiliate parent they have. And that's another thing that's so stupid. And I'll go off this track, maybe back to the Junger a little bit. But anyway, the stupidity is all this desire for parents. Why do you need a parent union? For what reason? Why can't the local take care of its own? You have just as much power, if not more, as a local than you do with the state and the national. What do you need this for? I mean, I'm totally against this at this point. You know, why would anybody in their right mind be paying AFT money?
So much money, and it's certainly not because AFT is ever going to call a general strike and defend us.
Take a plane ticket to Kiev. Yes, that's what she did. Yeah, Patrick. Yes, yeah. You're laughing.
Meeting with Zelensky.
With Volodymyr. Oh, Volodymyr, I like you so much. You know, we're both Jewish. You can hear the conversation. You know, where'd your family come from? I got the whole thing. So anyway, let me go back to the Junger, and I won't keep everybody for the Fidel Castro lectures tonight so late. So I know, well, for Beryl, it's what is it, 10:30 in Australia, or yeah, 10:30, 10:20? Yeah. Okay, good. All right. Well, I feel better. Okay. So anyway, the withering. He uses this metaphor of the withering away as well, and the notion of the good in the church. And again, let me just mention with Nietzsche. Nietzsche saw this, right, in many ways. And Nietzsche he missed, in my opinion, he misthought, obviously, the French Revolution in a way, but he understood at some levels what this become, right? In terms of weak dialectic, if you will, and the weak appropriation. Again, with all due respect, and he understood this in very, very good ways. And we can learn from this too, I think from the Nietzschean approach. Okay, so he goes on to the collapse of the hierarchies, and then he goes in terms of the early types the types of negative side of reduction, the reduction of the number to figures and symbols, and then he uses types such as the dandy, the prostitute, all of which Benjamin, worked on very actively in the Arcades project, and Bataille, who mapped all the prostitutes in Paris in the 1920s through types, from the streets to the courtesans, right? This is Bataille at work in terms of his own ethnography. So he has some interesting thing. And then he goes, the Hollywood funeral industry, right? Belongs to entertainment industry, which is interesting. He speaks to this, the motorizing heresies and as an economic fact, and the discords that threatens to erode beneath the radical parties and distinguishes so meaningful the years after 1945 from those after 1918. And Junger, in a way, is kind of saying, is there a major difference post-1918 with the beginning of the Wilson offensive, right, versus that of the Marshall Plan? Is there much difference? And this is something worth thinking about, is this transatlantic remaking of the world, how comparable is, quote unquote, the 1918 to through Weimar period, right, in a way in Germany, to that of 45 till the 50s and the early 60s, again in Germany. So many ways. So he goes on the new direction of spirit and the idea of perception. Then he goes on to the sense of the crossing the line, and this is number 14, from 1949 and over, at the 0 point, divides the drama. And this is interesting on the line itself. And this is page 87, section 14, divides the drama and indicates the midpoint, but not the end. And this is very important. The midpoint, and the meridian, but not the end. Security is still far away. Hope for it will be possible. The barometer reading improves in spite of external journeys. dangerous, excuse me, and that is better than having it fall while the appearance of security persists. It is just as little to be supposed these phenomena can be understood theologically. So there's this return to Dostoyevsky that we cannot really look at this phenomena across the line and the passage that divides the line where we really are. If one takes the word in the strict sense, whether one presumes that they will be manifest in every field to which belief is tied, and therefore, especially to the world of figures. And in fact, we recognize that at the boundary, and this is important, where mathematics and the natural sciences meet, that these are powerful changes underway. Astronomical, physical, biological conceptions are being transformed in a way that exceeds a mere change of theorems. So he's looking again at the line intellectually, advances in learning and knowledge, at the same time looking at this as, quote unquote, where nihilism has led us. Admittedly, we have not still transcended, right, the style of factories, although an important distinction emerges. The landscape of the factories, I understand, is essentially based upon a comprehensive obliteration of the old forms in favor of the greater dynamism of the processes of work. The entire world of machines, traffic, and war, and this again goes back to the war machine, how war production, and we'll talk about this more when we get to Alliez and Lazzarato, right? A war along with their destructions belonged here. In frightening images like the burning of cities, obliteration reaches the highest intensity. Pain is immense, and nevertheless, the form of the age is realized in the midst of the historical annihilation. Its shadow falls on the plowed earth, on the sacrificial ground. The contours of something radically new follow it. The eye still reflects upon changes of decoration, which are distinguished from that of the world of progress and the Copernican consciousness. We have the impression that the ceiling, no less than the scenery, are coming nearer in a concrete way and entering into new perspective, and anticipate these new figures will also take the stage. Besides, one will fail to see that in the world of facts, nihilism approaches its final ends. You know, this is interesting. We maybe think about this world of facts, fact checking, everything that we hear, this kind of new positivism that goes along with digitalization. Is this the end? Is this the beginning of the end of nihilism, right? In some ways, are we reaching that end point, right? And you know, how ugly that could be. When we enter into its zone, only the head was in danger. The body was still secure. Now it is reversed. The head is on the other side of the line. Very interesting, right? Meanwhile, the lower dynamism continues to mount and builds towards an explosion. We live with terrifying hordes of missiles calculated for the indiscriminate destruction of great parts of the human race. It is no accident that the same powers are at work here that discriminate against the soldier who still understands, and this is interesting because he's against this technical warfare. He would be totally offended by drone warfare, right? And what's going on, right? Who still understands the rules of combat and the difference between combativeness and defenselessness, right? And defenseless. This is very important to keep in mind that Junger in some ways is I don't know if nostalgic's the right word, but he sees that warfare and the art of warfare really has changed, right? And it's no longer an art. It is really Robert McNamara. These are technicians at work. You know, he anticipates the whiz kids from the Ford industry, from factory to Pentagon. And we can think about this operatively in terms of everything. Where do Blinken and Sullivan, Avril Haines, you know, Victoria Nuland, where do these people come from? How are they formed? Madeleine Albright, you know, you can go back, Wesley Clark, you know, et cetera, et cetera. What is really going on here? These are not really what Junger's talking about, the notion of the soldier, the notion of the agon, right? And in a way, he bemoans, if you will, and again, I don't think it's nostalgic. I don't think he's a nostalgic thinker, but he bemoans the loss of agon, right? In many ways, of this combat in terms of the human, right? Instead of the machines, right? So now that the process should be judged Not that this process should be judged simply meaningless, as it does not help to shut our eyes in front of it. And this is one of the reasons, I guess, for this course, to kind of think what we're really facing here, and going forward, right? It is an expression of the worldwide civil war in which we're involved. And we will see civil war play out again. He's writing this in 49 civil wars, right? Right? Remember, the Civil War in 1949, post-World War II, Lazzarato and Alliez are writing on wars of capital and civil wars and hybrid wars 70-something years later. So this is very, in some ways, very ahead of its time. He says, it is an expression, and the enormity of powers and of means permits us to conclude that at present everything is at stake. Let us add to this common characteristic of style. All this points to the world state, and again, the unipolar world, the new world order, if you will. The Great Reset. Schwab, I don't know if you guys read any of this stuff, the Great Reset for, out of Davos that Schwab, their representatives came up with for the pandemic. No longer question of the nation state. And you think Negre and Hart had original ideas? Listen to the sentence. It is no longer a question of the nation state, nor of territorial boundaries. It is about the entire planet, right? So planetary technology for Heidegger, Kostas Axelos, who I like very much, who is an attempted synthesis between Heidegger and Marx, right? And Junger really see this in terms of planetary technology, right? In a way, what is it be given to us, right? In a sense, right? So to go on, this is one of the first signs, if you will, of hope. And this is interesting. This is like Heidegger. What will be revealed in this greatest danger is a sign of hope or some liberation. For the first time, a steady, objective purpose arises in the midst of boundless progress and its changes. And the will to attain it is not merely a matter of power politics. It corresponds much more to the opinion that one hears on every street corner and every railway compartment. At the same time, the opinion spreads that a third world war, even if not inconceivable, it is still not inevitable. It is not impossible that world unity could arise through treaties. It could be promoted by the rise of a third power, which would be conceivable in a united Europe. 2, the upheaval could attain to a degree that would lead one of the rivals to fail within peace. Then, of course, there's the unforeseen. This urges upon all judgment that with enough strength of spirit, neither optimism nor desperation is a given, the unforeseen. So again, like Kojève after World War II, the great, Hegelian who was in Paris, who stayed in Paris and became a Gaullist, who was the architect, if you will, the thinker behind general agreement and tariffs. He is the architect of GATT, the precursor to the European Union. This is where he went, and I know I mentioned last week that it's certainly worth reading the letters between him and Leo Strauss. It's in a book called On Tyranny, which is how they responded to On Tyranny of Xenophon, and they had a long debate about this that played out in a journal called Interpretation. So anyway, you're beginning to think, this is a thinking of people that went through the 30s and the 40s, who ended up in positions either of power or in positions of, great repute. Heidegger, of course, as you know, was a victim. I don't know if it's a victim. He was denazified, so to speak. He couldn't teach for a number of years. He had his money, he got his salary still, but he went to the Black Forest and kind of, received people. Then he came back to teaching with Eugen Fink, giving papers. He gave Art and Space. He gave On Time and Being, many little short pieces after that, but never wrote a major treatise like Being and Time anymore. He never really, in some ways, fulfilled the second announcement, if you will, of Being in Time. So anyway, but then of course Kojève, who was giving lectures from 33 to 39 in Paris, to the likes of Lacan, Bataille, Jean Hippolyte, Simone de Beauvoir, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, et cetera, down the line, becomes the architect of the new trade and treaties, so these are men of the, Heidegger goes back to the Black Forest, but Junger stays in the mix too, very much, and so he's trying to think this through. So he says, then the question of what is to be done. This is section 15 and 16. What do you do? Countless persons have brooded, is the theme of our age. It does not lack an answer. On the contrary, he says. He's going to reply here, right? Page 89. It is a sheer variety of answers that is confusing. Health does not arise when everyone is a doctor. I like this, right? That's good. Yeah, the true causes of our situation are unknown and are not illuminated by premature clarifications. These barely touch upon secondary aspects. It could be that we judge too favorably. It could be that the proximity of the disaster to us confuses the view and that later phases will shed more light on the epoch in its totality. That when we would be a sign that nihilism is nearing its end, perhaps before long, one will see it in a completely different context. In a similar way, knowledge of the remedy is limited. If we knew one great arcanum, the situation would lose its difficulty. Rather, it bears the mark of uncertainty and risk. And this is, again, something we're so afraid of. We're so conditioned to this security principle, right? In a sense, the inability to take risks, the inabilities to understand fear, how it's administered, where it is for us, the uncertainties that we're really facing. Every remains an experiment. On the contrary, we can assert that anyone who toots surefire prescriptions, like, we're going to win in the Ukraine, right? This proxy war, right? Is either a charlatan or someone who's not yet noticed that the writing is on the wall, right? In a sense, right? And we're not talking about, and we should hopefully in this course a little bit about the newly formed Eurasian, economic union, right? And what does this mean for the future of capital and wars, right? In a way, and in a sense, right? So whether in the sciences, this kind of assurance shows what remains of the 19th century has not yet been entirely reduced. We might recommend types of conduct, practical advice for negotiating the nihilistic terrain, since in the end, there's no lack of experience. The free man is already obligated by reason of self-preservation, and this is Spinoza's freedom, by the way. Conatus, one's self-preservation, is the first mark of freedom, right? In some ways, the force of self-preservation, right? And to think about how we'll behave in a world where not only nihilism only rules, but its worse has become the norm, right? The nihilism has become the norm. That such a reflection has already become possible is the first sign. And like Heidegger, he sees indications, these signposts, if you will. There's a semiotic here of hope, if you will, right? That become, that's better in clear weather of a view that reaches further than the domain of powerful obsessions, right? So this is one aspect here of what is to be done. It is necessary to mention something else that must seem disturbing or even considerable to one who's not considered these latitudes on the line, right? And again, to go back and study the line, cross it, because across the line is where Junger wants to go. Heidegger did not want to cross the line. He thought it was too dangerous. You needed to study it more, right? This line, that they're dealing with. With the crossing of the equator, the old figures are no longer valid, and a new calculation must begin. This pertains especially in the inevitability of destruction. The conservative posture, whose representatives are worthy of respect, often worthy of admiration, is no longer capable of capture and damming up the waxing movement, as still seemed possible after World War I. For the conservative must rely upon areas not yet in motion, like the monarchy, right? The nobility, the army, and the countryside. But when everything is in flux, the starting point is lost. Accordingly, one sees young conservatives defecting from static to dynamic theories. They encounter nihilism on its own ground. This is a sign that things since the days of the old Prussian Maurizio have gone extremely far. At that time, and Maurizio was a cavalry general in the First World War. Anyway, At that time, it still might have seemed that only one granary, one was in flames. For widespread conflagrations, other measures were necessary. Here one conceives a new plan. There's no doubt that our situation as a whole is crossing over the critical line. With this, danger and security change. This paragraph is important. One can no longer think how to remove one house, one single property from the path of the firestorm. Here, no ruse, no flight can help. On the contrary, a whiff of absurdity clings to things saved in this way, or at best something museum-like. This also goes for intellectual matters. Today, it means little if a thinker maintains his point of view through the decades, doesn't change the thought, etc. Again, the praxis nursing home for the left, right? They don't want to change the thinking, in a way. Nobody's trying to erase history. We know how to work and write history. We don't want to revise history. We want to move into the new situation. We don't want to be stuck back there with the same old concepts, the same worn out ideas. And anyway, so today it means little if the thinker maintains through the decades. Even development appears insufficient in these strange worlds. It is rather metamorphosis in Ovid's sense, mutation in the contemporary sense, mutation. What figures are offered to the mind that moves like salamanders through a fiery world? Here it sees images that associate themselves in an older way, impossible for them to stand fast, even if they lie in an older way, in Tibet, There it sees the line where all values dissolve and where pain takes their place. There he notices contours taking shape that require, above all, sharp eyes, be like germs or like the core of crystals. And all these situations require another approach, which must appear muddled and completely contradictory to whoever cannot imagine both the negative and the positive side of annihilation. A Babel-like confusion divides the intellectuals, the theme of which is the exact location of the null point. Knowing this would certainly allow one to know the future system of coordinates. And again, the thinking of the line is to establish a new set of vectors, a new moment, right, in terms of the calculus here. A perspective is even possible when the line appears as a depth marker or as in an excavation. One penetrates to order by clearing away the rubble of ages, raising what the fellows built. In this respect, one sees strong minds serve the power of leveling inherent in nihilistic methods and terminology. Here belongs, and this is Nietzsche, the philosophy of the hammer, about which Nietzsche boasted, or the title, and this is from a socialist, so you can see Junger is very fair in a way. Leon Bloy had printed on its calling card, demolition expert. You can hear this, the leader of the French socialist, this is my calling card, demolition expert, right? It remains vital to know to what extent the intellect submits to the necessary destruction and whether the march across the desert will lead to a new well. That is the task our age harbors, insofar as the solution depends on character. And again, I emphasize that. That's Marcuse, Benjamin, and Junger, and many others, right? Of course, takes a part in it. There is therefore a question of fundamental value to which one must submit today's persons, works, and organization. It is, to what extent have they passed or crossed over the line? Yeah. Yeah. And I have to look at the German here. I'll look at it. If it's passed over, like passing around it, or just passed over in terms of a passage, or is it across the line, et cetera. So this would be interesting to look at, but I think it's a passage over the line. Okay. The confusion intimated appears at first where one rightly supposes the heart of our difficulties, namely in matters of belief. Its supposition is a progress, right, towards something better compared to the total indifference. And Peter, you still here? No, Junger uses late liberalism as a term, indifference 1949 or worse. The catastrophe of the Second World War has made clear to many, even to the masses, an emptiness that they otherwise did not feel. This is the creative power of suffering, and such attempts at healing merit particular care and cultivation. Here's your Stiegler in a certain way, the economy of care and the economy of contribution, post 68, post 9/11, post, French reaction, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, the churches would be the first, that is their office, but immediately question, how far are they capable, the churches, of offering help, right? I mean, maybe it's condominiums for people without houses, right? We could talk about it that way. But anyway, means that the question is inevitable is for precisely unexpected evidences that could stockpile the material for an entree of nihilism. That's what we described in the beginning with a drama of prayer to which nothing transcendent corresponds and would then become an empty gesture, an automatic action, even lower since it feigns value. And that's interesting always to look at the feigning of value in the church. That is the moment in which the rotation of a motor becomes, right, stronger, more meaningful than the millionfold repetition of formulaic catechisms or prayers. Many whose eyes have been sharpened by nihilism shrink back from such a repetition. Posed in this way, the question does not remain in suspense long. It is foreseen, and the moment which the line is passed brings a new turning approach of being, capitalized, uppercase, Sein. And with this, what is actual begins to shine forth. This will be even visible to dull eyes. New celebrations will follow on this side of the line. One cannot, however, judge this state of affairs. We remain in the situation, and this goes back to what David was saying, the situation of nihilistic conflict, in which, without doubt, not only more sensible, but also more worthy, right, to be on the side of the church rather than on the side that attacks it. This is interesting the way it goes. This fact has appeared only, and it still appears today. After all, cannibalism and enthusiastic worship of the beast have not been instituted the applause of the masses. We have the church and a few soldiers to thank for it. At times, I think a lot of this is tongue in cheek. I hope so. At times, it was quite close to happening, and already beneath its banners, there shone and shines still the splendor of Canaanite, I guess pagan instructions. By the way, Lyotard, after May of 68, wrote a book called Pagan Instructions, right? This kind of return to the pagan culture would be one way of getting around the things that are happening. Other powers scattered all the more quickly, socially and humanly they behave. One should leave them to their own bloodless decomposition. The forced retreat of the churches would either abandon the masses entirely to technical collectivization and its exploitation, or drive them into the arms of every sectarian and charlatan. And we see that with the right in the United States, right? I mean, how this happened, right? Which today play their games at every crossroad. The culmination of a century of progress and 2 centuries of enlightenment. One hears the suggestion that the masses be left to their will, which drives them so clearly towards annihilation. This would make permanent the slavery in which millions languish and would exceed the terrors of antiquity, but without its elimination. And he goes on, we want to avoid convenient and current confusion. We must establish theology, right, by no means finds itself in a condition capable of encountering and confronting nihilism. He's very well aware of this. The Dostoyevskian complex, the Kierkegaardian complex, if you want to think of it that way, are not adequate for this at this point, right? And it fights much more against the rear guard of the Enlightenment, therefore finding itself entangled in the nihilistic discourse. And this is interesting, the rear guard of the Enlightenment, what happened there? Okay, more hopeful is the fact that individual sciences on their own are moving towards images that are capable of a theological interpretation, above all, astronomy, physics, and biology. They appear after their expansion to be approaching again a concentration with more restricted, sharper, and therewith perhaps also more human view, provided that one conceives the world afresh or anew, phenomenologically, if you will. Here one must guard against hasty interpretations. The results speak the most, right? New questions are still subjected to experiments. This will bring new answers. For their comprehension, philosophy will not be sufficient. And this is interesting because Heidegger, as you know, wrote a very famous piece, The End of Philosophy and the Task of Thinking. And this is very important to keep in mind because Heidegger provided closure on the history of philosophy. to work through that closure is part of our task, but at the same time, the real task is the thinking, right? He mentioned science does not think, right? Yeah, and this is why he said Junger is not a philosopher. He actually mentioned this about Junger. He's not a philosopher. Okay, so and then he goes in the orthodox core and all of this, and goes on. So I find this again. I won't read the whole thing. Again, he exegesis, the developments between prophets and high priests. He mentions Kierkegaard and Bishop Minster, repeated perpetually how the theological novel appears again in the Anglo-Saxon world, that Sterne had already done that in Tristan Shandy, as we know. If you really read this in the parodic, James Joyce always put to death liberal capitalism in the life of a one Leopold Bloom in 18 in everyday Dublin, right? In a sense. So we have these moments here, but still we haven't digested it or fully brought it to consciousness in every day. So we have the three facts, the metaphysical at the bottom of page 93, last paragraph. The three facts: the metaphysical discontent of the masses, the emergence of the individual sciences from the scientific revolution of the Copernican turn, and then the treatment of theological themes and world issues are the positive elements of high rank, the way we should think through, right? So again, he's a traditionalist in this sense, and it's not minor literature like Deleuze and Guattari, but he is thinking this through in terms of these levels, right? And then he goes, in addition, there's a sort of an elan, simultaneously sober and energetic resolve that cannot be found with such clarity after 1918. So he's again comparing 45, 49 to 18 to 20, 21, in a very good way. It's encountered when suffering is great and distinguishes German youth, more meaningful than victories, which after a test one returns home from the ruins, from the pockets, from captivity. There's no high spiritedness, but in its place, the renewed courage to drain the cup grows, right? This weakens in the attack, but gives immense forces to the resistance and swell the ranks of the defenseless. So he goes on, the will to sacrifice, substance, the danger of meaningless waste always lies near on the line. And he goes on, the age of the monster state has begun. The new Leviathan, I think I mentioned this last week, Freddie Perlman's book out of the anarchist Detroit group, the new Leviathan, worth looking at. But of course, Behemoth, going back to Patrick with Leo Lowenthal, Franz Neumann's great book, Behemoth, which is probably the greatest description of the Nazi state still today. I mean, there have been a lot of books that riff off of it, but really in terms of a comprehensive, that was the Frankfurt School's great contribution to state theory, in my opinion. Yeah, you know the book, Patrick? Yeah. Great book by Franz Neumann. Lived in the Bronx, by the way. Yeah. Marcuse, took up his wife, his wife after Neumann died. Yeah, and raised Michael Neumann, the philosopher in Toronto. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. They used to walk on Sundays together. I heard stories about that, and make fun of all the people in the Bronx's dress. These German intellectuals, right, would take these long walks as the flaneurs and dandies, walking down the street. Anyway, okay, so this is about the German in a certain way, and then it goes on, the indomitability later in the thing, the confrontation with Leviathan, both as an external and an internal tyrant, is the most comprehensive and universal in the world. One thing we're not doing, and McPherson is very good at this on the left, the theory of possessive individualism is a very good book on the Hobbesian universe. But we really should be rereading Leviathan, how this monstrosity came to be called the state, in a sense. We're always looking for other things and we're complaining, but really in a way, this is the monster, really, Hobbes, of our time. He said, my mother gave birth to twins, the Spanish Armanda and me. He said when he was born. Yeah. So anyway, the monster of Malmesbury. Yeah. This was a thinker of the of the Commonwealth, of imperialism, if you will. Yeah. This is the handbook. This is what has to be read and read in between. So anyway, he goes on. One is based upon fear of inner emptiness and compels man to manifest himself externally through the development of power, control of space, and increased speed. All three elements of modern warfare state in the Leviathan very early. The other works from the outside as an attack on a powerful world, simultaneously demonic and automated. And he goes on, the death, it is illusory. The indomitability of Leviathan rests in this duplicity, demonic and automated. The death it promises an illusion, and therefore more terrifying than death on the battlefield. Very interesting, this automated warfare. Even robust warriors are not equal to it. Their mission does not lead them beyond the illusions. Hence, the glory of arms must grow pale when the ultimate reality, superior to appearance, is what counts. If one succeeded in felling the Leviathan, it would still be necessary to fill the space. And this is interesting too. What happens after the overthrow of the state, right? What happens if it's felled? In such a situation, however, inner emptiness, the state of unbelief, is incapable of assuming such a position. This is why we see an effigy of Leviathan fall. New forms sprout like the heads of the Hydra. The emptiness demands them. The same difficulty made it impossible, to prevent encroachments within the state directed against the individual. One can think of situations in which small elites would be allied in earlier times against the demos in order to break the teeth of Leviathan and damage it. A decline would follow. We're experiencing it now, where the elites are siding to break the teeth, of the state and damage it. They could be assured of a majority, even of unanimous consent. It would change nothing. The creation of short-lived idols would still be the best that could be expected. New centers would then form unless Leviathan were simply to seize possession of easy prey from the outside in order to leach out their substance more powerfully, even than its despots. It loves quietist ideology, propagates them, but only alongside others. Things aren't therefore so simple. Astonishingly, even man on the street sees it quite soberly. He has paid the bill, after all. The age of ideology, still possible after 1918, has passed. They're little more than the light grease paint. And this is something that people from Foucault, Daniel Bell was one of the first to go through the end of ideology, as a lot of you know. But Foucault actually went after Althusser and said, we will leave it to these people to think their stupidity in terms of ideology still. This is interesting. That Foucault did not want anything to do with ideology and to think about ideology and ideological state apparatuses at a certain point. And Junger is maybe part of the influence there with Heidegger, in terms of the shift, if you will, after World War II. So anyway, it goes on, a little more than light grease paint on the face of the great powers. Total mobilization has reached a stage that surpasses even the past in its power to menace, right? The German is clearly no longer its subject, and with the danger grows that he's understood to be its object, and after finishing his obligation, is cheated on his wages. Certainly, one cannot address this process simply by ignoring it. It demands a political attitude. The more urgent, the more is one defenseless, even if the political decision has been reduced and restricted only to the choice of a patron. And he goes on, one of the chess moves of the Leviathan lies in getting the youth, and this is important. How is this mobilized? Imagine that its summons is identical to that of the fatherland. What is going on in the world today? Maybe not so much in the United States, but what is happening in Ukraine? What is happening in conscripted armies at this point? In this way, it recruits its best victims, the best victims, right? So anyway, then he needs to start to conclude here about within a restricted field, still possible in number 20, and not given by remaining neutral, to go back what David Winters was talking about, this fear of polemics, this fear of conflict. There's no freedom in this, right? It is a kind of slavery. It's a mental slavery. It's a new technique, as Bratsis and I and Bruno Gulli are trying to articulate new techniques of servitude. How do you keep people in servitude, right? In mental servitude in some ways. The inability to act, the inability to act in an active nihilistic way, if you will. Or, how is this done, right? In so many ways. So he goes on, again, Junger, this will not be, renders the Leviathan the service that suits it, for which it maintains the armies of police. And, he goes on about this police state as well. But again, he's going to propose that there is some oasis in the desert, right? Despite his, ongoing pessimism throughout this, he says that they're powers, right? And what are the powers? Well, the first power, as you probably know, is freedom, right? That's the first power. The second power is eros. The second fundamental power at the bottom of the page is eros. When two individuals love, they are ground from Leviathan. They seize the ground, creating the space that cannot be controlled, right? And he talks about Henry Miller. And this is the guy reading Henry Miller, a staid German reading Henry Miller, right? In them, sex is a weapon against technology. And this is an interesting read of Miller, very much like the beginning of Anti-Oedipus, which Deleuze and Guattari did later, It redeems redemption from the iron chains, turning it to it annihilates the world of machines, right? In a sense, right? Anyway, with all due power to James Brown, the machine and sex, right? Anyway, very, very interesting because he has this thing of freedom, eros, and of course, the notion of what eros has as a power. This is not eros in Civilization of Marcuse, but a different way, right? Of looking at this. And then art as the final moment, right? The meaning of art cannot be to ignore the world, and this there has little serenity. And he goes on about the art in the face of the machine as well, right? So this is the other aspect, rest in form and what happens. So anyway, it is similar for the thinker in his age, the fear that men feel panic and as blind strokes of fate. That's the way it is. All the slogans. That's the hand I was dealt. These are the et cetera, et cetera. And he wants to go against that. And in fact, the call in the thing is for the poetry of the dwelling and the thinking, as well as the experimental, the character of the kind of thinking with the pre-Socratics and the Gnostics. So we'll go there on page 100, the poet is thinker, the poet is dweller. And then he goes on, the Holzwege as the beautiful word 101, which is Heidegger's term. Holzwege, of course, is, the forest path or the woodcuts, if you will, in the forest. I got a bit of that when I spent last summer in the Gaspésie, looking at the wood paths coming down a mountain of a place where I spent looking to make sure I didn't run into a bear on the way down. But anyway, I was looking at all the wood stumps, and that's how I guaranteed my path back safely. Anyway, all to say. So this is another thing off the beaten track. How displaced are we? Where are we? And in a sense, I think this is an opening that actually it predicates, if you will, the thinking of Deleuze, Guattari, and Mille Plateau, as well, of course, Alliez and Lazzarato later, because what they're doing here, both Heidegger and Junger, but particularly Junger in this piece, is thinking through otherwise thinking. How do we get outside to that otherwiseness, right? By examining the line, across the line, etc. What does that mean? And he has many, many things here. And I like the combination of freedom, eros, and art, right? This is a very interesting combination to think through. Again, what this means is another story, but we can talk more about that. He knows the age least who has not experienced the immense power of nothing in himself and has not been tempted by it. The center of the world, the authentic heart of deserts and ruins, is once in Theobad. The cave besieged by demons, here everyone stands, regardless of condition and rank, in direct and sovereign struggle, changing the world with their victory. No one prevails. If one prevails here, nothing will recede. It will deposit treasures from the flood along the shore and compensate for the sacrifice. You get the idea of the birth of the new here. Obviously, very biblical in some ways. Junger, who's seen the storm of steel, right, and many other things in the trenches. So anyway, any comments about this? I think it's a very beautifully crafted piece, and if you think it through in terms of the line, again, I think that there's something to be said for reading it. And I'm trying to justify the protocol of readings, obviously. Yeah. So any thoughts before? On the line, across the line. And, this was first translated in a little Semiotext book called On the Line. And I have the German too, just the pamphlet that came out, not this whole thing. So this was much more elaborate than was circulating many years ago, this new thing in the Heidegger Junger correspondence, yeah. So anyway, yeah. So 49, we would fast forward now to 80, a different kind of war, post-Vietnam, for me, World War III broke out 1945, national liberation struggles, of which the Algerian 1962, independence was one of the first direct results. The Cuban Revolution, as you know, in 59. And this was written 49, and you all know the revolution in 49 is the Chinese Communist Revolution, right? And the beginning of the Korean War. So it's not like World War III began right away. And I have categories. I haven't thought this out completely, but another marker for me would be OPEC in 73, the transference of wealth from one part of the world to the other, to the oil-rich nations, which still dictate a lot, in collusion with US finance capital by all means. But, and anyway, and then of course, now we have a new thing brewing, the old, unipolar world is now going to be maybe upset by a multilateral world than a unilateral world. And this is something worth considering. So we have many, I agree with Lazzarato and Alliez. This is a whole combination of many civil wars. Yeah, going on. Yeah, and post-World War II. So the line is shifting all the time, but I think that nihilism is still with us, especially in the West, right? Yeah, we're facing this. This is one of Stiegler's responses. Certainly others, right? Yeah, many ways. Yeah. Okay. So anybody? I'll close here. I thought we went through it pretty well. Yeah. David, any thoughts? Yeah.
No, I'll just say I'm looking forward to moving from this piece to know about